Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still can't bring myself to walk across suspension bridges. Not after what happened that night at the school in French Gulch. My wife tells me I need to move on, but some things just stick with you, you know? I've never written this down before, but maybe getting it out will help. This was back in 2008, before we joined the church and moved to Sacramento. Hannah and I were newlyweds, both of us just 24, and we'd taken jobs at this private boarding school tucked away in the Trinity Mountains. The pay wasn't great, but they provided housing, a small trailer on the property, and it seemed like a good way to save money while we figured out our future. The school was built on an old ranch property, with buildings scattered across both sides of a creek. The main facilities, admin building, cafeteria, cookhouse, and staff housing, were on one side, while the boys' cabins were clustered on the other. Part of my job as a resident advisor included doing midnight bed checks, which meant crossing that damn creek every night. Usually, I'd just wade through the ford if the water was low enough. My boots would get wet, but it was quicker than taking the long way around to the suspension bridge by the cookhouse. But that night, February 11th, it had been raining for days, and the creek was running high and fast. Too dangerous to cross at the ford, so I had to use the bridge. It was around 11:30 when I finished my paperwork in the admin building. The temperature had dropped to maybe 35 degrees, and I remember the bite of the cold air as I stepped outside. The sky was clear for the first time in days, with a half moon providing just enough light to see by. I had my flashlight, but I tried not to use it much. Your eyes adjust better to the dark that way. I made my way to the bridge, crossed over, and did my rounds at the boys' cabins. Everything was normal. Some kids still awake when they shouldn't be, the usual hushed conversations that stopped when they heard my footsteps on the porch. By midnight, I was heading back toward the bridge, ready to return to our warm trailer and crawl into bed next to Hannah. That's when I heard it. A clattering sound coming from near the cookhouse. The trash cans were being disturbed, and my first thought was, damn bears again. We had problems with black bears getting into the garbage almost weekly. The school administration refused to invest in bear-proof containers, insisting that proper disposal procedures were enough. They weren't. I was tired and annoyed. If a bear scattered trash everywhere, guess who'd have to clean it up in the morning? Me. So I decided to scare it off before it made a mess. I picked up a few river rocks from the path, good-sized ones about the size of baseballs, and quietly made my way onto the bridge. The bridge itself was one of those swinging types with wooden planks and high cables on either side. It wasn't very wide, maybe 4 feet across, and it swayed with every step. I stopped about halfway across, giving myself a good vantage point to see the cookhouse and the row of trash cans lined up against its back wall. In the dim moonlight, I could make out a dark shape moving between the cans. It was bigger than I expected, but I still assumed it was a bear. I raised my arm and threw the first rock, aiming to hit the metal can next to the animal to scare it off. The rock hit with a loud clang, and that's when everything changed. The creature made this sharp huffing sound, not a growl, not a snort, but something in between, and then it stood up. It just kept rising. I'm not exaggerating when I say my blood went cold. The cookhouse had these eaves that were at least 8 feet high, and this thing's head and shoulders were clearly visible above them. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. No black bear in California stands that tall, not even close. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. I was frozen in place, halfway across a swinging bridge, staring at something impossible. Then it turned toward me. Its movement wasn't like a bear's awkward waddle on hind legs. It moved like a person, like a very large man, but wrong somehow. Too fluid, too comfortable on two legs. It stepped away from the trash cans and into a patch of moonlight, and that's when I saw its silhouette clearly. Broad shoulders, long arms, a head that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders with no discernible neck and fur or hair covering its entire body. My brain finally kicked into gear and I shouted, "Hey!" As loud as I could. I stomped on the bridge planks, making the whole structure shake. I threw another rock which hit the ground near its feet. I was hoping all this noise and commotion would scare it off, like it would with a normal animal. It didn't run, it didn't even flinch. Instead, it moved toward the bridge, toward me. I yelled again, throwing my last rock directly at it. The rock hit. I heard the thud, but the creature didn't react. It just kept coming, reaching the bridge entrance in about 4 strides. When its foot hit the first plank, the entire bridge sagged under its weight. That's when true panic set in. I was trapped on a narrow suspension bridge with something huge coming for me. I turned and ran for the other side, the bridge swinging wildly with each step. I reached solid ground and spun around, expecting to see the creature still on the other end. Instead, it had already crossed the free-swinging section in just 2 strides. It was moving fast, too fast for something so large. I backed away, grabbing more rocks from the ground. I hurled them one after another, hitting it several times, but it was like throwing pebbles at a brick wall. The rocks just weren't heavy enough to do anything. In the moonlight, I caught a glimpse of its eyes. They reflected the light like a cat's or dog's eyes do at night. A greenish-yellow glow that somehow made this whole nightmare even more terrifying. It was maybe 20 feet away now at the end of the bridge, close enough that I could smell it. This rank, awful stench like dead meat mixed with rotten food and stale sweat. The smell was so powerful it made my eyes water. I had no weapons, no way to defend myself. In desperation, I grabbed the bridge supports and began rocking the structure violently, hoping to make it too unstable for the creature to cross. That's when it did something I still can't explain. It reached up with one massive hand, grabbed the high cable that ran along the top of the bridge, the one that was at least 10 feet above the walkway, and in one fluid motion vaulted itself over the side. I heard a splash as it hit the creek below, followed by the sound of water churning as it ran upstream. Not downstream toward the open areas, but upstream into the dense woods. I stood there, gasping for breath, straining to hear where it had gone. For a few seconds, I could hear branches breaking and undergrowth being crushed. And then, nothing. Just the normal sounds of the night forest and the rushing creek below. The smell lingered, though, that putrid, unmistakable odor that I've never encountered before or since. I don't remember running back to our trailer. The next thing I clearly recall is Hannah shaking me by the shoulders, asking me what was wrong. Apparently, I'd burst through the door, locked it behind me, and was pacing around, unable to form complete sentences. She said I was as white as a sheet and shaking uncontrollably. It took me nearly an hour to calm down enough to tell her what happened. Even then, I couldn't find the right words. How do you describe something you've never seen before, something that shouldn't exist? I called campus security, but the night guard just laughed when I tried to explain. He said I'd probably seen a bear, and my imagination had done the rest. The next morning, I showed my supervisor the trash cans, which were dented and scattered, but he just shrugged it off as another bear problem. No one believed me. Why would they? I barely believed it myself. We stayed at the school until the end of the semester, but I never did another night check alone. Hannah would come with me, both of us carrying bear spray and making enough noise to wake the dead. We never saw the creature again, but sometimes, when the wind was right, I'd catch that same foul odor near the creek. We left that summer, moved to Sacramento, joined the church, and tried to build a normal life. I never told anyone else about what happened. What would be the point to be laughed at, to be called crazy? I've spent countless hours researching since then. I've read about Bigfoot sightings in the Trinity Mountains going back decades. Some descriptions match what I saw, the height, the movement, the smell. Others don't. I'm not saying it was Bigfoot. I'm not putting a label on it. All I know is what I saw wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a costume, and wasn't something I can explain. It was massive, intelligent enough to react to my attempts to scare it off, and moved in ways that defied its size. I still have nightmares about those glowing eyes and that rancid smell. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear heavy footsteps on our roof or the sound of our trash cans being disturbed. Hannah says I need therapy. Maybe she's right. But what do you tell a therapist? That you had a close encounter with a creature that supposedly doesn't exist? All I know is that I saw something that night by the creek. Something real. Something that shouldn't have been there. And not a day goes by that I don't wonder if it's still out there in those mountains, watching and waiting for someone else to cross that bridge alone at night. Story 2. I still get shaky when I think about it. August 12th, 1980. That date is burned into my brain like a brand. It's been over 40 years, but I remember every detail like it happened yesterday. I've only told this story to a handful of people because, well, who the hell would believe me? But I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone else has seen what I saw. I was 23 then, living in Roscommon County, Michigan. It was a Tuesday night, and my buddy Rick and I had been at this house party at the lake. Nothing crazy, just some beers, music, hanging out. It was summertime, you know. We left around 10:30, maybe 10:45. I remember checking my watch as we got in Rick's van because my mum was expecting me home and I didn't want her to worry. Rick had this old Chevy van, one of those boxy ones from the 70s, olive green with a stripe down the side. The seats were high up, so you had a good view of the road. We were both pretty straight that night. I'd had maybe 2 beers over 4 hours, and Rick wasn't much of a drinker anyway. That's important because I need you to understand we weren't drunk or high or anything when this happened. We were driving down this back road, County Road 103, this winding stretch through the woods that connected the lake area to the main highway. No streetlights out there, just pitch black, except for the headlights. Rick was doing about 45, nothing crazy. We had the radio on low, I think it was the Eagles or something, and we were just talking about normal stuff, work, girls, whatever. It was dead quiet out there, no other cars, no houses nearby, just trees on both sides of the road, thick pines that made everything seem darker. The air was coming through the cracked windows, warm and smelling like pine and that earthy summer smell. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how nice it was to be out here away from everything. Then it happened. We were coming around this gentle curve when suddenly Rick slams on the brakes. I mean, slams them. I flew forward and the seatbelt locked up across my chest, knocking the wind out of me. The tires made this horrible screeching sound on the pavement. I thought we'd hit a deer. They were always jumping out around there. But what I saw next, God, I still get goosebumps. There was this thing right in front of the van. The headlights were shining right on it. It was standing upright on 2 legs, but it was bent at the waist, like it had been moving on all 4s and just stood up. And it was looking directly at us. The first thing I noticed were the eyes. We were so close, maybe 3 or 4 feet away, that I could see they were bloodshot, with these huge, dark pupils that seemed to reflect the headlights. Not like a deer's eyes that glow. This was different. More human-like, but not human at all. Its head was small compared to its body. That's what struck me as so weird, and it was covered in this long, matted fur, a muddy brown color with these lighter patches that looked almost blonde in the headlights. The fur was hanging in clumps, like it was wet or hadn't been groomed, ever. Here's what really gets me. Its hip was level with my line of sight inside the van. Do you understand what I'm saying? I was sitting up high in that van, and this thing's hip was at my eye level. That would make it, 7-8 feet tall, at least. We locked eyes for what felt like forever, but was probably less than a second. There was this intelligence there. and fear. It looked startled, like we'd surprised it as much as it surprised us. Its mouth was slightly open, and I could see steam coming from its breath in the headlights, even though it was August. Then it moved, 4, maybe 5 steps, and it was across the entire road and into the trees on the other side. Its arms were long, way too long, and they swung as it moved. It didn't run like a person. It was this fluid, powerful motion that covered so much ground so quickly. Just as it disappeared into the tree line, another car came around the bend from the opposite direction. They swerved hard to avoid us. We were still stopped in the middle of the road and ended up in the ditch. I saw their tail lights at a weird angle as they skidded off the road. Rick hit the gas without saying a word. He was white-knuckling the steering wheel, breathing hard. I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was closing up. We drove for maybe 2 minutes in complete silence, the radio still playing like nothing had happened. Finally, I managed to say, Did you see something back there?" Rick pulled over so fast I thought we were going to crash. He turned to me and his face was white as a sheet. His hands were shaking. "I didn't want to say anything," he whispered. I thought I was losing my mind. "That wasn't a bear," I said. My voice sounded strange, like it wasn't my own. "No," Rick said, "it wasn't a bear." We sat there on the side of the road for a long time, trying to process what we'd seen. Rick kept saying, "It was looking right at us, man, right at us." Over and over, I remember this weird feeling washing over me, not just fear, but this profound sense that the world was much stranger than I'd ever imagined, like the rules I thought existed didn't actually apply. It's hard to explain unless you've felt it. We debated about turning around to check on the other car, but honestly we were too shaken up, and what would we say? "Sorry we made you drive into a ditch, but we were avoiding Bigfoot." They'd think we were drunk or crazy. We never reported it. What would we even say to the police? "Officer, we saw a giant hairy man creature on County Road 103. They'd breathalyze us on the spot. Plus, in a small community like ours, we'd never live it down. We'd be those crazy guys who claimed they saw Bigfoot. But I know what I saw. And it wasn't a bear standing up. It wasn't a guy in a costume. And it sure as hell wasn't my imagination." The next day, Rick and I met up at the diner in town. We were both exhausted. Neither of us had slept. We tried to talk through it rationally. Could it have been a guy in a costume? No way! The proportions were all wrong, and nobody could move like that. A bear? Bears don't walk on 2 legs for that distance, or with that kind of gait. Plus, the head shape was all wrong. We actually drove back out there in the daylight. I don't know what we expected to find. Footprints, I guess. But it had rained lightly overnight, and the ground was just mud and pine needles. We did notice broken branches about 8 feet up on some of the trees where it had disappeared into the woods. 8 feet high. Think about that. Over the years, Rick and I would occasionally bring it up when we were alone. We'd try to rationalize it, but we always came back to the same conclusion. We saw what we saw, and what we saw wasn't supposed to exist. Rick moved away a few years later. We lost touch, as people do. Sometimes I wonder if he still thinks about that night as much as I do. I've researched Bigfoot sightings in Michigan since then. Turns out Roscommon County has had quite a few reports over the years. Makes sense. It's heavily forested, lots of swamps and remote areas where people rarely go. Perfect place for something to hide. The thing that still haunts me most is those eyes. They weren't animal eyes, not completely. There was something aware in them, something that recognized us as humans, that understood what we were. It was frightened of us, I think, not aggressive, just scared and trying to get away. I'm 59 now, and I've never seen anything like it again, though I've spent a lot of time in those woods since then. I've gone camping, hunting, fishing, always with this sense that I'm being watched. I catch myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement, for those eyes. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I do. If someone told me this story, I'd think they were full of crap, or had seen a bear in poor lighting, or were drunk out of their mind. But I know what I saw. Rick knows what he saw, and whatever it was shouldn't exist according to science. But it does. I still live in Michigan, though not in Roscommon County anymore. I've only told this story to my wife, my brother, and now, well, whoever's reading this. Most of the time, I try not to think about it, but sometimes, when I'm driving on a dark road at night, I catch myself slowing down around curves, my eyes fixed on the side of the road, half expecting to see that figure again, standing there, looking back at me with those impossible, intelligent eyes. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it's still out there, but I know what I saw that night changed something fundamental in how I understand the world. There are things in the deep woods that we can't explain, that shouldn't exist but do, and sometimes, if you're unlucky or lucky enough, I still can't decide which, you might catch a glimpse of them. If you're ever driving through the back roads of Roscommon County late at night, keep your eyes open, and if you see something tall moving at the edge of your headlights, something that stands up and looks at you with eyes that seem too aware, well, now you know you're not the only one. Story 3. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. I'm not the type who believes in conspiracy theories or spends time looking for the paranormal. I'm a regular guy who works construction, hunts during season, and rides ATVs on weekends. What happened last May in Sam Houston National Forest has been eating at me though, and I need to get it off my chest. My buddy Chris and I had been planning to hit some trails that Saturday since the weather was perfect, about 75 degrees, sunny with a light breeze. Late spring in East Texas can be beautiful before the summer heat and humidity make outdoor activities unbearable. We loaded up my Honda Foreman in my truck and headed out around 3 in the afternoon, figuring we'd ride until dusk. We had been on the trails for maybe 2 hours, taking turns driving and just enjoying being out in nature. The forest was lush and green from all the spring rain, and wildflowers were popping up along the edges of the trails. We'd seen a few deer earlier and even a wild hog, with some piglets crossing about 100 yards ahead of us. It was around 6:30, with the sun starting to get lower, but still plenty of light, when I was driving with Chris, hanging onto the back. We were on one of the wider trails, probably about 12 feet across, that runs for several miles through a particularly dense section of the forest. I remember oak trees and pines creating this sort of tunnel effect over parts of the trail, with thick underbrush on both sides. I wasn't going fast, maybe 20 miles per hour, just cruising and enjoying the ride. Chris had shouted something about being hungry, and I turned my head slightly to respond, probably only looking away from the trail for 2 or 3 seconds at most. When I turned back, my blood went cold. Standing dead center in the trail, about 50 yards ahead, was something. I immediately eased off the throttle, not slamming on the brakes, but definitely slowing down. At first, my brain tried to categorize it as something familiar. A bear standing up, maybe? But there aren't supposed to be any bears in this part of Texas. A person in dark clothes? No, this was too big, too broad. My mind raced through possibilities in those few seconds as we continued moving forward, now at maybe 10 miles per hour. This thing was tall. I'd estimate between 6 and 6.5 feet. But it wasn't just the height that was imposing. It was built like a linebacker, with an incredibly broad chest and shoulders. The entire body was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur, either black or very dark brown. It was hard to tell in the dappled light coming through the trees. What struck me most was how natural it looked standing upright. This wasn't an animal rearing up temporarily. This thing stood like a human, with its weight balanced evenly on 2 legs that looked proportioned like a person's. Its arms hung down at its sides, noticeably longer than a human's would be, with large hands that I could make out even at that distance. I couldn't see its face clearly from that distance, but I could tell it had a somewhat conical head shape without a distinct neck. more like the head just blended into the shoulders. There was something deeply unsettling about its silhouette against the background of green forest. "Holy shit!" I yelled back to Chris. "Do you see that?" The moment I made noise, the thing's head snapped in our direction. There was nothing animal-like about that movement. It was deliberate, alert, intelligent. For maybe 1 second, we stared at each other across the distance. Then it moved. And God, the way it moved. That's what I can't get out of my head all these months later. It pivoted sharply and launched itself off the trail into the woods to our right. It didn't drop to all fours like a bear would. It ran upright, with a smooth, powerful stride that ate up ground with terrifying efficiency. Its arms pumped slightly as it ran, but not in the exaggerated way a human's would. It was like watching an Olympic sprinter who happened to be covered in fur and built like a tank. The speed was what really got to me. This thing covered maybe 30 feet to the tree line in what felt like a second and a half. One moment it was there, the next it was crashing through the underbrush. Even after it disappeared from view, I could see branches and foliage moving and swaying from its passage, reaching surprisingly far into the woods in just seconds. "What? See what?" Chris was shouting from behind me. I stopped the ATV completely now, my heart hammering in my chest. That thing, right there in the middle of the trail. Chris leaned around me, looking down the now empty trail. "What thing? I didn't see anything, man." I pointed frantically toward where the thing had disappeared into the woods. "It just ran off into the trees there. Look at the bushes moving." Chris squinted in that direction, and I could see he was genuinely trying to spot what I was talking about. The movement in the vegetation was already settling. "I see some branches moving, but that could be anything. Probably a deer we spooked." I shook my head vigorously. That was no deer. It was standing upright. It was huge. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what I was describing. I'm not the type to jump to conclusions about Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever, but sitting there on that trail, the word kept flashing in my mind. But saying it out loud seemed ridiculous, even in that moment. "Let's check it out," Chris said, already climbing off the back of the ATV. Part of me wanted to gun the engine and get the hell out of there, but another part needed to know. I turned off the ATV and we cautiously walked down the trail to where the creature had been standing. The ground was mostly hard-packed dirt with patches of pine needles and leaves, not great for tracking. But as we reached the spot and looked toward where it had entered the woods, there was a clear path of disturbance through the underbrush. Broken twigs, bent saplings, and trampled vegetation. "Something big definitely went through here," Chris admitted, looking more serious now. We followed the trail of broken vegetation for maybe 30 feet into the woods. The forest was incredibly dense here, with vines, thorny bushes, and saplings growing between the larger trees. How anything could move quickly through this was beyond me. The trail of destruction suddenly seemed to vanish, as if whatever made it had either changed direction completely or somehow stopped disturbing the vegetation. "Could have been a hog," Chris suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "They can get pretty big." I shook my head. It was standing upright, like a person, but bigger, broader, and covered in dark hair. Chris gave me a long look. I could tell he was trying to decide if I was messing with him or if I'd genuinely seen something, like a bear. "There aren't supposed to be bears here," I said, though I was almost hoping that's what it was. And it didn't move like a bear. It ran like an athlete, on 2 legs. We stood there in silence for a moment, the forest suddenly feeling much more threatening than it had all day. The late afternoon sun was casting longer shadows now, and every rustle of leaves in the breeze made me tense up. "Let's get back to the ATV," I finally said. We hurried back to the trail, both of us glancing over our shoulders repeatedly. Once we were back on the Honda, I didn't waste any time. I started it up and accelerated faster than I normally would, wanting to put distance between us and that section of forest. As we rode, I kept scanning the woods on either side of the trail, half expecting to see that dark shape keeping pace with us just beyond the tree line. My mind was racing with questions. If this was what I thought it was, why hadn't it attacked us? Was it just as surprised to see us as we were to see it? Was it watching us even now? After we'd gone about 2 miles, I finally slowed down enough to talk to Chris. I explained exactly what I'd seen in detail. The height, the build, the way it moved, everything. He listened without interrupting, and I could tell he was genuinely trying to understand. "Look," he finally said, "I didn't see it, so I can't say what it was or wasn't. But I know you, and you're not the type to make stuff up or exaggerate. If you say you saw something weird, I believe you saw something." That was probably the best response I could hope for. We finished our ride in relative silence, both on high alert. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified: the distant call of a bird, the rustle of leaves, the crack of a twig. I kept thinking I saw movement in my peripheral vision, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. We loaded up the ATV earlier than planned and headed home. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying those few seconds in my mind, the creature standing there, the way it moved, the intelligence in its reaction. I've spent countless hours since then researching similar sightings in East Texas, and there are more than you might think. It's been 3 months now, and I still haven't been back to that specific trail. I've ridden other parts of Sam Houston National Forest, always with someone else, and always with this nagging feeling of being watched. I'm not saying I saw Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. I honestly don't know what I saw. What I do know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it moved through that dense forest with an ease that defies explanation. Maybe it was some kind of undiscovered species. Maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that the forests I've been comfortably exploring my whole life suddenly feel different now, bigger, older. Like they're hiding things we're not meant to understand. And sometimes when I'm alone at night and the house is quiet, I swear I can hear branches breaking in the distance. Story 4. I've been holding onto this memory for over 50 years, and I swear it still feels like it happened yesterday. Back in 1967, May of 1967 to be exact, I was just 11 years old, living with my family in Rogers City, Michigan. My sister Diane was 13, and we were as close as sisters could be, despite the typical bickering. Our house was nothing special, just a modest 2-story place with white siding that needed a fresh coat of paint and squeaky front steps that announced everyone's comings and goings. What made our location unique was what sat across from us, a thick, dense patch of woods that seemed to swallow all light and sound. Even on the brightest days, those woods looked dark, like they held secrets. Everyone in the neighborhood knew something was off about those woods. For months, people had been hearing these weird sounds coming from there at night. Mom called them blast horn owl moans, but they weren't like any owl I'd ever heard. They were deep, almost human-like howls that would start low and then rise up before trailing off. Years later, I heard recordings of something called the Ohio Howl and got chills. It was exactly what we used to hear. Between our house and my friend Susan's place was a narrow dirt road that cut between the woods and the old cemetery. Mom had forbidden us from using that road 100 times. "Take the long way around," she'd say. "I don't want you girls anywhere near those woods." She never really explained why, just gave us that look that meant business. But we were kids, and that road saved us 15 minutes of walking. So of course we used it anyway when Mom wasn't looking. It became our regular shortcut to Susan's house, where we'd spend hours playing board games and trading Tiger Beat magazines. That day in early May was perfect, warm enough for short sleeves, but not yet sticky with summer humidity. The spring flowers were blooming, and everything smelled fresh. Diane and I had spent the afternoon at Susan's house, and we were biking home around 4 o'clock. Susan's mom had made us cookies, and I remember having chocolate smudges on my fingers as I gripped my handlebars. We were pedaling side by side down that forbidden road, racing each other like we always did. The cemetery was to our right, rows of weathered headstones catching the afternoon sun. To our left was the thick wall of trees, their new spring leaves a bright green against the darker pines. I was ahead of Diane, pumping my legs as fast as I could on my blue Schwinn with the white basket, when something caught my eye in the woods. I slowed down, squinting into the trees. "What's that?" I called back to Diane, pointing. About 30 feet into the woods was what looked like a burned-out tree stump, a big black mass among the browns and greens. It was odd because I didn't remember seeing it before, and we rode this path at least twice a week. Diane pulled up beside me, and we both stopped our bikes, one foot on the ground for balance. "I don't know," she said, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Looks like someone burned a tree or something." We stared at it for a few seconds, and that's when a light breeze picked up. The leaves rustled around us, and that stump, it moved, not like it was blown by the wind, but like it was adjusting itself. My stomach dropped as I realized what we were looking at wasn't a stump at all. It was something alive, something big. "Dee," I whispered, not taking my eyes off it. "That's not a stump." The thing was covered in long, shaggy black hair, not fur like a bear, but hair almost like a person's, but much coarser and denser. It was sitting cross-legged on the ground, perfectly still, except for that slight adjustment when the breeze came through. Diane grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. It looks like an old Indian sitting cross-legged," she whispered. But it wasn't human. As we stared, frozen in place, I could make out more details that made my skin crawl. Its face was flat and ape-like, with a pushed-in nose that reminded me of a pug dog. Its forehead was low, and its eyes... I couldn't really see its eyes from that distance, but there was something deeply wrong about the way it was watching us, because it was watching us. I could feel it. Its arms were the worst part, long and thin like a praying mantis, folded over those crossed legs. Even sitting down, it was enormous. I'd guess at least 5 or 6 feet tall, just in that position. If it stood up, it would tower over my dad, who was 6'1". We didn't say another word to each other. Some primal instinct kicked in, and without a signal, we both started pedaling like our lives depended on it. My heart was hammering so hard, I could feel it in my throat. The wind rushed past my ears as we flew down that dirt road, not caring about the bumps that sent us bouncing on our seats. I remember looking back once, just once, and seeing that thing uncross its legs. It was standing up, but I didn't stay to watch. I pedaled harder than I ever had in my life. We burst out of the road and onto our street, not slowing down until we skidded to a stop in our driveway. We dropped our bikes on the lawn and ran inside, both of us talking at once, voices high and panicky. Mom was in the kitchen making dinner, and the look on her face shifted from annoyance to concern as we babbled about what we'd seen. I expected her to dismiss it, to tell us it was just our imagination or a big man playing a prank. Instead, her face went pale. "Where did you see this?" she demanded. When we admitted we'd been on the forbidden road, her fear turned to anger. "I told you girls never to take that road. You're both grounded for a week." But she believed us. That was the strangest part. She didn't question what we'd seen, just punished us for being where we shouldn't have been. Later that night, I overheard her telling Dad in hushed tones, and he went to check that all the doors and windows were locked, something he rarely did. The weeks after our encounter were filled with strange happenings. A horrible smell like rotten meat would waft from the woods on hot days. Neighborhood pets started disappearing. First the Johnson's cat, then old Mrs. Miller's terrier. No trace, no remains, just gone. At night, I'd sometimes wake up to odd chuckling sounds outside my window. Not human laughter, but not an animal sound either. Something in between that made me pull the covers over my head and squeeze my eyes shut. One morning, Dad found huge barefoot tracks in Mom's vegetable garden. They were over 15 inches long, and deeply pressed into the soil, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Dad took Polaroid pictures and showed them to his buddy who worked for the DNR, but he just shrugged and said they were probably from a bear walking on its hind legs. But bears don't leave five-toed footprints with an arch like a human foot, and they don't leave muddy, hairy handprints on garage doors, which is exactly what we found one morning on our detached garage. The prints were 8 inches across, with fingers longer than my dad's. About 2 weeks after our sighting, my friend Susan came over to play. Her mom dropped her off because she refused to walk alone anymore. When I asked her why, her face got all serious. "I saw a werewolf in the woods by the cemetery," she whispered, eyes wide behind her glasses. "I felt like someone had poured ice water down my back." "What did it look like?" I asked. "Tall, black, walking on 2 legs but hunched over. It had long arms." She shuddered. "I was riding my bike and it stepped out onto the path ahead of me. I turned around so fast I fell off. When I looked back, it was gone." Susan never walked to our house again. Her mum always drove her and she always left before dark. The summer wore on and the weird happenings continued. Diane and I stuck together whenever we went outside, and we never, ever took the cemetery road again. Sometimes at night, we'd hear those moaning howls from the woods, and we'd sneak into each other's rooms to sleep together, finding comfort in not being alone. One night in July, I woke up around 3 in the morning, needing to use the bathroom. Our house was dead quiet except for Dad snoring down the hall. As I tiptoed back to my room, I glanced out the hallway window that faced the woods. There, at the edge of the trees, was a massive dark shape. It was too dark to make out details, but I could see it was on 2 legs and easily 7 feet tall. It stood perfectly still, like it was watching our house, watching me. I ducked down below the window ledge, my heart trying to pound its way out of my chest. When I finally gathered the courage to peek again, it was gone, but on our front lawn, clearly visible in the moonlight, was a path of trampled grass leading from the woods to just below my bedroom window. The next morning, I told my parents. Dad got his hunting rifle out of the cabinet and kept it loaded by the front door for the rest of the summer. Mom started driving us everywhere instead of letting us bike, even in broad daylight. By the end of August, the sightings and strange occurrences began to taper off. The howls became less frequent, and no more footprints appeared in the garden. By the time school started in September, things had mostly returned to normal, but I never felt safe in that house again. Diane and I refused to sleep with our windows open, even during the hottest nights. I never again used the cemetery road, and I avoided the woods completely. The following year, my dad got a job in another town, and we moved away. It was the biggest relief of my young life. To this day, I don't know what we saw in those woods. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Wendigo. People have lots of names for these things. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it knew we had seen it. Sometimes I still dream about those long mantis-like arms and that flat ape-like face watching us from the trees. And I wake up with my heart racing, feeling 11 years old again, pedaling for my life down that dirt road with something unnatural rising to its feet behind me. Story 5. It was supposed to be a normal camping trip. Me, Michael Anderson, and 5 of my buddies, Ken, Dave, Rick, Tom, and Steve, decided to get away for the holiday weekend. We picked this remote spot between the Dosa Wallops and Dukabush rivers, not far from Mount Jupiter. Beautiful area, really dense forest, hardly anyone goes there. We've been camping together for years, all experienced outdoorsmen. We set up our camp Friday afternoon about 100 yards from a small creek. The weather was perfect, warm days, cool nights. We had 3 tents set up in a small clearing surrounded by old-growth trees. After setting up, we grilled some steaks, had a few beers, nothing crazy, just 6 guys enjoying the wilderness. We turned in around 11 that night, planning to do some fishing the next day. That's when everything changed. Around 4 in the morning, Ken shook me awake. Ken's always been the lightest sleeper of our group. "Mike, did you hear that?" he whispered, his face pale even in the darkness of our tent. I was groggy. "Hear what?" "Listen." We sat there for maybe 30 seconds in complete silence. Then it happened. This roar. But calling it a roar doesn't do it justice. It was deep, powerful, like nothing I've ever heard in my life. It cut through everything, the sound of the creek, the wind in the trees, everything. It seemed to come from the direction of the creek bed, maybe a quarter mile away. Ken looked at me. What the hell was that? I had no answer. I've heard bears, cougars, elk, everything that lives in these woods. This wasn't any of them. It was too deep, too deliberate. We both sat there for another 15 minutes, but didn't hear it again. Eventually, Ken went back to sleep, but I couldn't. I kept replaying that sound in my head, trying to match it to something I knew. Nothing fit. The next day, nobody mentioned it except Ken. The others hadn't heard anything. We spent the day fishing, hiking, normal camping stuff. But I couldn't shake that sound from my mind. That evening, we were all sitting around the campfire. It was about 9 o'clock, just getting dark. We were passing around a bottle of whiskey, telling the same old hunting stories we always tell. Then we heard it again. The same distinctive roar from the night before, coming from the same direction, but closer this time. Maybe only a few 100 yards away. Everyone froze. Dave dropped his cup. Tom's face went white. "What the hell was that?" Rick whispered. I knew immediately what it was, though I almost couldn't believe it myself. I've spent my entire adult life in these forests. I've read the reports, heard the stories, even laughed at them sometimes. But in that moment, I knew exactly what we were hearing. "That's a Bigfoot," I said quietly. Nobody laughed. Nobody made jokes because they all knew I wasn't the type to say something like that unless I was dead serious. "Are you sure?" Tom asked. "No," I admitted. "But I've heard every animal in these woods. That's not a bear, not a cougar, not an elk. It's not anything I recognize." We sat there in silence for a while, just listening. The fire crackled. The creek gurgled in the distance, but no more roars came. Around 10:30, we decided to turn in. Everyone was on edge. We made sure the fire was completely out, didn't want to attract anything. I brought my hunting pistol into the tent with me, a .44 Magnum. Would it stop whatever made that sound? Probably not, but it made me feel better having it. We'd been in our tents for maybe half an hour when it started again. The vocalizations, but this time they were much closer to our camp. Maybe only 100 yards away, in the thick brush between us and the creek. The roars came intermittently. Each one felt like a physical force, a shock wave passing through the trees and hitting our tents. They weren't just loud, they were powerful. I could feel each one in my chest, like standing next to a subwoofer. "Mike?" Dave whispered from his sleeping bag. "What do we do?" "Nothing," I said, clutching my pistol. "We stay in the tents. We don't go out there." The vocalizations continued for about 45 minutes. Sometimes they'd stop for 5 or 10 minutes, and we'd think it was over. Then another would rip through the night, closer than before. I've faced down angry bears. I've been stalked by cougars. But I've never felt fear like I did that night. There was something intelligent about those sounds. They weren't random animal noises. They felt directed at us. Around midnight, they finally stopped. We sat in our tents, barely breathing, just listening. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects chirping, no night birds, nothing. Just absolute silence. Nobody slept. We just lay there waiting for dawn, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. At about 4:30 in the morning, it started again, one final round of vocalizations. They lasted about 10 minutes, deep, powerful roars that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if the thing was circling our camp. Then silence again. When the sun finally came up, we were all exhausted, strung out from fear and lack of sleep. We debated whether to look for tracks down by the creek, where the sounds had first come from. "We should document this," Ken said, "if it really was a Bigfoot." But the bank leading down to the creek was steep and choked with brush. One wrong step and you could break an ankle or worse. After what we'd been through, nobody wanted to risk getting injured out there, miles from help. We packed up camp faster than we ever had before. Nobody wanted to spend another night there. The whole time I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see something watching us, but there was nothing, just the same peaceful forest that had seemed so welcoming 2 days earlier. On the drive home, we tried to rationalize what we'd heard. Maybe it was some kind of weird echo effect. Maybe it was a bear with a strange vocalization. Maybe it was anything except what we all knew it was. But I've spent 3 decades in these woods. I've heard bears in every mood. Angry, scared, mating. I've heard cougars scream. I've heard elk bugle. What we heard that night wasn't any of those things. It's been 2 months now. I still think about it every day. I've gone back and listened to every supposed Bigfoot recording I could find online. Some come close, but none capture the raw power of what we heard. The 6 of us have a pact now. We don't talk about that weekend with anyone else. Who would believe us? Just another group of crazy Bigfoot hunters, right? But we know what we heard, and we know we're never going back to that spot between the rivers. Sometimes at night I wake up suddenly thinking I've heard that roar again. I never have, of course. But the memory of it is burned into my brain. That deep, powerful sound that cut through everything else. The sound of something that shouldn't exist but does. I've spent my life in the wilderness of Washington State. I thought I knew these forests. I thought I understood what lived in them. Now I realize I don't know anything at all. And the worst part, sometimes I find myself wanting to go back, to know for sure, to see what made those sounds. But then I remember the fear I felt that night, the primal, gut-wrenching terror of being hunted by something ancient and powerful, and I know I never will. Whatever was out there that Labor Day weekend, it wasn't human. It wasn't any animal I recognize. It was something else entirely, and it knew we were there. Story 6. I don't normally share this with people. Most times when I try, I get those looks, you know the kind, where people are trying to decide if I'm crazy or just making stuff up for attention. But what happened to me back in fall of '83, and then again years later with my kids, was real. I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I still can't sleep with the window open even now. I was 24 back then, living in this little house just outside of town in Ionia County, Michigan. The place was nothing special. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, and surrounded by woods on 3 sides. I'd bought it cheap because it needed work, but I liked the privacy. No neighbors looking in your windows, you know? At least that's what I thought was a good thing at the time. It was early October, around 7 in the evening. The sun had just gone down, and I was getting ready to take a bath after a long day of yard work. I remember the leaves had started turning that week, all those oranges and reds outside my windows. I'd been raking most of the afternoon, and my back was killing me. The bathroom was at the back of the house, with this small rectangular window high up on the wall above the tub. It was probably about 6 feet off the ground from the outside. I'd never bothered with curtains since it faced nothing but trees, and the window was frosted anyway. Who was gonna see in? That's what I kept telling myself. I had just filled the tub and was testing the water temperature with my hand when I got this weird feeling. You know when the hair on your neck stands up for no reason? Like that. I thought maybe I'd left a door open and was feeling a draft, but something told me to look up at the window. I nearly had a heart attack right there. There was a face, or what I thought was a face, looking in. At first, all I could process was that someone impossibly tall was standing outside my bathroom window, but as my eyes focused, I realized this wasn't a person. The window was small, maybe 14 by 20 inches, but whatever was out there was so huge that its head and shoulders took up most of the view. It had this dark, matted hair covering most of its face. The hair was long and shaggy, not like a beard, but like its whole head and face were covered in this thick, coarse fur. The color was hard to tell in the dim light, but it looked dark brown, or maybe black. And the smell, God, even through the closed window there was this musty, wild animal smell that somehow seeped into the bathroom. What really got me were the eyes. They weren't animal eyes, not exactly. They were set deep under a massive brow ridge, and they looked intelligent. They were staring right at me with this intense focus that made my blood run cold. They were dark, maybe brown or black, and reflected the bathroom light in a way that made them look like they were glowing slightly. I couldn't move. I just stood there, dripping water from my hand onto the floor, staring back at this thing. It must have been at least 8 feet tall to be looking down into that window. Its shoulders were enormous, wider than any human I'd ever seen. The proportions were all wrong for a person. We looked at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of its massive hand as it adjusted its position against the side of the house. The fingers were huge, covered in the same dark hair, with these dirty-looking nails that seemed too thick and wide to be human. That's when I screamed. I didn't even recognize the sound that came out of me. It was this high-pitched shriek of pure terror. I backed up so fast, I slipped on the bathroom floor and fell hard against the toilet, bruising my hip. When I looked back up, the face was gone. I ran through the house, turning on every light, locking every door and window. I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone to call my sister. She lived about 20 minutes away and came over right away. By the time she got there, I was sitting in the living room with a kitchen knife, jumping at every sound from outside. We checked around the house with flashlights. There were some broken branches near the bathroom window and what looked like a large footprint in the soft dirt of my flower bed, but it was too dark to really see details. My sister tried to convince me it was probably just a bear standing on its hind legs, but I knew better. Bears don't have faces like that. Bears don't look at you with that kind of awareness. I couldn't sleep in that house alone for weeks. When I finally did start sleeping there again, I'd wake up in cold sweats, thinking I heard something outside my window. Within a month, I had the bathroom window removed completely, just drywalled and plastered over the opening. I told the handyman it was to save on heating costs, but the truth was, I couldn't stand looking at it anymore, knowing what had been there. For years, I didn't tell anyone else what I'd seen. I knew what it was. It had to be what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but saying that out loud just made people think you were nuts. So I kept quiet and tried to forget about it. Then, 15 years later in '98, it happened again. By then, I had 2 kids. My daughter Amy, who was 12, and my son Michael, who was 10. We'd moved to a different house about a mile outside of Palo, still in Ionia County. The new place had more land, bordered by woods and fields. I'd never told my kids about what happened at the old house. What was the point in scaring them? One night in late August, we were walking back from a neighbor's house. It was probably around 9:30, and it was that kind of country dark where you can see every star in the sky. We were cutting across this field that separated our property from the neighbors, using flashlights to see where we were going. We were about halfway across when we heard it. At first, I thought someone was being murdered. It was this horrible screaming sound that started low and then rose in pitch until it was almost unbearable. It wasn't an animal sound, at least not any animal I recognized. It wasn't a lynx or a bear or a fox. It wasn't a deer or a rabbit. It was like a human scream, but distorted and mixed with something else, something primal. My kids froze. Michael grabbed my hand so tight his nails dug into my skin. "Mom, what is that?" Amy whispered, her voice shaking. Before I could answer, it came again, louder this time and closer. It seemed to be coming from the tree line about 200 yards to our right. The sound was so raw and powerful, it made my stomach turn. There's no other way to describe it. It was sickening, like hearing something in pain, but also something threatening at the same time. "Run," I said, pushing them ahead of me. "Run to the house, now." We took off across that field faster than I'd ever seen my kids move. I kept looking back over my shoulder, terrified I'd see something coming after us. The screaming continued, seeming to follow us along the tree line. But I never saw anything in the darkness. We made it home and locked ourselves in. The kids were crying, asking what made that noise. I told them it was probably just some animal, maybe a mountain lion, even though I knew we didn't have those in our area. I couldn't tell them what I thought it really was. I couldn't admit that the thing I'd seen all those years ago might have found me again. Over the next few months, we heard other strange sounds around our property. Sometimes at night, there would be these soft hooting noises coming from the woods, almost like what you'd hear from a chimpanzee at the zoo. Other times, there was this weird chittering sound, like teeth chattering but louder and more deliberate. My kids started to get scared of going outside after dark. I couldn't blame them, I was scared too, but I tried not to show it. I installed more outdoor lights and got a couple of big dogs, which seemed to help for a while. The dogs would sometimes bark at nothing in the middle of the night, staring out into the darkness with their hackles raised. I finally broke down and told my sister about both incidents. She suggested I talk to this old-timer who lived in the area his whole life. When I went to see him and told him my story, he just nodded like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Lots of folks around here have stories they don't tell," he said. "These woods have always had secrets." He told me that Ionia County, with its mix of dense forest and scattered fields, was perfect habitat for something that wanted to stay hidden but needed to move around. There were old logging roads and deer trails that connected vast areas of wilderness. A creature could travel for miles without ever being seen. I've done research since then. I've read accounts from other people who've had similar experiences. Some of the details match so perfectly with what I saw and heard that it gives me chills. I know there are skeptics out there. I used to be one of them. But when you see something like that looking in your window, when you hear those screams that don't belong to anything you can name, it changes you. My kids are grown now, but they still remember that night in the field. My daughter Amy told me recently that she still has nightmares about it. My son refuses to go camping or hiking, even with friends. Some fears stick with you. I still live in Ionia County. Some people might wonder why I'd stay after what happened. But this is my home. I've just learned to be more careful. I don't go out in the woods alone. I don't take walks after dark. And I absolutely never leave my windows open at night, no matter how hot it gets. I know what's out there. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've heard it with my own ears. And no amount of people telling me I'm crazy or mistaken will ever change what I know to be true. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night and the wind is moving through the trees outside, I swear I can hear those soft hoots again. And I wonder if it's out there, watching my house, remembering me the same way I remember it. Story 7. I've been debating whether to share this for years now. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to get this off my chest because it still haunts me, and maybe writing it down will help me process what happened. It was May of 2018, and I'd been planning a trail camera project in the Great Smoky Mountains for months. I'm an amateur wildlife photographer. Nothing professional, just a hobby that got me out of the house and into nature. I'd been tracking deer patterns in this particular area for about a year and noticed consistent movement along certain trails. Perfect spot for my new cameras. That morning started like any other hiking day. I packed light, just my backpack with the 2 trail cameras, some tools, water, snacks, and my phone. The weather was perfect, around 65 degrees with a slight breeze. I remember feeling excited about finally setting up these cameras after saving for them for months. I parked at this small pull-off about 2 miles from the main tourist areas. It's an access point I'd found that lets you get deeper into the park without dealing with the crowds. I'd been there maybe 5 or 6 times before and never saw another person. The hike in took about 45 minutes. I remember checking my watch when I reached the first location. It was around 10:30 in the morning. The spot was perfect. A natural funnel where a fallen tree created a narrow passage along a deer trail. I secured the first camera about 4 feet up on an oak tree, angled it toward the trail, tested it to make sure the motion sensor was working, and then headed uphill to place the second one. The second location was about a quarter-mile away, higher up, where the forest opened slightly into a small clearing. I mounted that camera on another tree facing a game trail, tested it too, and then started heading back down toward my car. That's when everything changed. I was maybe halfway back to the first camera location when I heard it, this loud smack sound, like something hitting wood with serious force. My first thought was that maybe a branch had fallen, but it was too deliberate, too purposeful. It sounded like someone had taken a baseball bat and swung it against a tree trunk with everything they had. I froze in place. The forest suddenly felt different, tense, like the air before a thunderstorm. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, not moving, just listening. Then I heard wood snapping, like branches breaking under weight. My heart started pounding, but I told myself it was probably just a bear. I've encountered black bears before while hiking, and while they deserve respect, they're usually more afraid of you than you are of them. Then the scream came. I've spent hundreds of hours in these mountains. I've heard coyotes, foxes, bobcats, all kinds of birds, even mountain lions once or twice. This wasn't like any of those. It was primal, powerful. It started low and then rose in pitch until it was this piercing sound that seemed to vibrate through my chest. It wasn't just loud, it was overwhelming. I felt it more than heard it. Every instinct told me to run, but I didn't. Instead, I slowly moved forward, staying low, trying to see what made that sound. I was about 20 yards from where I'd placed my first camera when I saw it. Standing there, right by the tree where I'd mounted my camera, was something. Even now, years later, I struggle to describe it accurately. It was tall, much taller than me, and I'm 6'1", maybe 7 or 8 feet tall, but it was the mass that was most shocking. This thing was huge, not just in height but in build. Its shoulders must have been 3 feet across. It was covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, more like hair, longer in some places, especially around the shoulders and arms. The hair wasn't uniformly black. In the sunlight filtering through the trees, I could see reddish-brown highlights. Its arms were proportionally too long for a human, hanging almost to its knees. The hands, God, the hands were massive, with thick fingers that looked powerful enough to snap branches effortlessly. I couldn't see its face clearly from my angle, but I could see enough to know this wasn't a bear standing on its hind legs. The head sat directly on those massive shoulders without much of a neck, and it moved in a deliberate way that was disturbingly intelligent. As I watched, frozen in place, it reached out and grabbed my trail camera, just ripped it straight off the tree where I'd carefully secured it not even an hour before. The screws and mounting bracket must have torn right out of the bark. Then it held the camera between those huge hands and simply crushed it. I heard the plastic cracking from where I stood. After destroying my camera, it dropped the pieces to the ground. Then it threw its head back and let out another of those screams. That sound, it silenced everything. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just absolute stillness after the echo faded. Then it turned slightly, and for a moment I thought it was going to look directly at me, but instead it moved away, pushing through the underbrush with such force that I could hear branches snapping for several seconds as it disappeared into the forest. I don't know how long I stood there barely breathing. My legs felt like they'd turned to concrete. My mouth was bone dry, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. Every instinct told me to run back to my car, but I also knew I needed to retrieve what was left of my camera, not just because those things are expensive, but because I needed proof of what I'd seen. I waited maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like hours, before I slowly approached the tree. The camera was destroyed. The casing cracked open, the lens shattered, but miraculously the SD card was intact, still in its slot. I grabbed the pieces, shoved them in my backpack, and then practically ran to check on my second camera. It was untouched. I took it down quickly, not wanting to leave anything behind, and then made my way back to my car as fast as I could without actually running. The whole time I felt watched. The forest that had always been my sanctuary now felt alien and threatening. When I got back to my car, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before managing to unlock the door. I remember sitting there for a few minutes, just trying to breathe normally before I could even start the engine. I drove straight home, probably breaking the speed limit the whole way. I didn't stop for food or gas, even though I'd planned to grab lunch in town after my hike. I just needed to be somewhere safe, somewhere familiar. When I finally got home, I went straight to my computer and inserted the SD card from the destroyed camera. I wasn't even sure if it would work, but it did. The card had recorded about 50 minutes of footage before being destroyed. Most of it was just the forest, occasional birds landing nearby, wind moving the leaves. Then, in the last 10 seconds of footage, a massive hair-covered hand appeared in frame, reaching toward the camera. The fingers were thick, with dirt under the nails that looked almost like claws. The palm had these calluses that no human hand would have. Then the image jolted violently as the camera was torn from the tree, and the recording stopped. I must have watched those last 10 seconds 100 times that night. I examined every frame, looking for anything that might explain what I'd seen as something ordinary, a bear with mange, some kind of elaborate hoax. But the proportions were all wrong for a bear. And who would go that deep into the forest to pull a prank that no one would likely ever see? That was 5 years ago. I've only shown the footage to 3 people. My brother, my best friend, and a biology professor at the local community college. My brother thought it was a bear. My friend thought I'd edited the video as a joke. The professor just looked troubled and asked me exactly where I'd been that day. I still go hiking, but never alone anymore. I haven't put up another trail camera since. I'm not going to claim I saw Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. I'm just telling you what I experienced. Whatever was out there that day was real, it was massive, and it was intelligent enough to identify and destroy a camera that was observing it. Sometimes I wake up at night hearing that scream in my dreams. That sound wasn't just aggressive, it was territorial, a warning, and I got the message loud and clear. The forest isn't just ours, something else considers it home, and it doesn't want to be watched. Story 8. I still get chills thinking about that night. It's been over 9 years since April 2014, but I can recall every detail like it happened yesterday. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or cryptids. I was the skeptic of our group, always finding the rational explanation. Now, I'm not so sure about anything anymore. Me, Jake, and Chris had been planning this camping trip for months. We're all in our late 20s, working office jobs in Jacksonville, and desperately needed to disconnect from emails and deadlines. Jake suggested Okala National Forest, since none of us had been there before. We wanted somewhere remote, but not dangerous, or so we thought. We arrived around 10 in the morning on a Saturday. The weather was perfect. Mid-70s, slight breeze, not too humid for Florida. We parked at one of the smaller trailheads, one that didn't seem very popular. There were no other cars in the small gravel lot. I remember Chris joking that we'd finally found a spot in Florida without tourists. If only we'd taken that emptiness as a warning. We hiked about 1.5 miles from the car, following a trail that gradually became less maintained. The forest was beautiful, tall pines towering overhead, palmetto bushes scattered across the forest floor, and that fresh, earthy smell you can't get in the city. We found a nice flat clearing that seemed perfect for our tent, far enough from the trail to feel isolated, but not so far that we'd get lost. Setting up was easy enough. We had this big 6-person tent. Even though there were only 3 of us, we liked having the extra space. We spent the afternoon hiking, exploring the area within about a mile radius of our camp. We saw some deer tracks, a few birds, nothing unusual, just normal forest stuff. Jake took photos of some interesting fungi. Chris collected a couple of cool-looking pine cones. I was just happy to be away from my computer. We got back to camp around 6, made dinner on our portable stove, just some freeze-dried meals and instant coffee. As the sun went down, we built a small fire in a ring we made with rocks, had a few beers, and just talked. Nothing crazy, just 3 friends catching up. We didn't even stay up that late. By midnight, we were all in our sleeping bags, tired from the day's hike. I fell asleep pretty quickly. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional breeze rustling through the trees and some distant owl hoots. Normal forest sounds that were actually kind of soothing, then everything changed. I woke up suddenly, that kind of instant heart-racing awakening where you know something's wrong before you even process what woke you. My phone said it was about 2:30 in the morning. At first I thought it was thunder, but the sound was too rhythmic. Thud, 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 like something heavy walking, deliberately stomping the ground. The footsteps were slow but powerful enough that I could feel subtle vibrations through the ground. I whispered, "Guys, you hear that?" Both Jake and Chris were already awake, eyes wide in the darkness. Jake had his flashlight in hand, but hadn't turned it on. Chris was completely still, barely breathing. "What the fuck is that?" Chris whispered. The footsteps got closer, and then they stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. We were frozen, not daring to move. Then I heard breathing, deep, heavy breathing with a slight growling undertone. Not like a dog or a bear, but something else, something bigger. Suddenly, whack! Something hit the side of our tent hard enough to make the whole structure bend inward. I nearly pissed myself. It wasn't a branch or something falling. It was deliberate, like something had slapped or punched our tent. "Holy shit," Jake whispered, so quietly I barely heard him. The breathing continued, circling our tent. I could hear sniffing noises now, loud and powerful, like whatever was out there was trying to smell us. It moved around the perimeter of our tent, and we rotated our heads following the sound, too terrified to speak or move. Whack! Another hit, harder this time, on the opposite side of the tent. One of our support poles bent dangerously. Another hit like that, and the whole tent might collapse on us. Jake looked at me and Chris and mouthed, "We need to run." We nodded. What else could we do? Stay there and wait for whatever it was to tear through the tent? Chris slowly, painfully slowly, reached for the tent zipper. The creature was on the far side of the tent now. We could hear its breathing and occasional snorts. Chris unzipped the tent just enough for us to squeeze out, trying to minimize the noise. The zipper sounded impossibly loud in the quiet forest. We grabbed our boots, didn't even put them on, and our phones. Nothing else seemed important. Jake turned his flashlight on the lowest setting, just enough to see where we were going. That's when I saw it, just for a split second at the edge of the tree line, a massive dark figure moving between 2 pines. It was tall, way taller than any person I've ever seen. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. All I registered was the size and the movement, too fluid and deliberate to be anything natural. We didn't hesitate. We ran. Barefoot, holding our boots, we sprinted toward the trail that would lead back to our car. Behind us, I heard the most terrifying sound I've ever experienced in my life, a scream that started deep and guttural before rising to a higher pitch. It wasn't human. It wasn't any animal I've ever heard. It felt like the sound physically pushed against my back as we ran. The forest floor was painful on our bare feet, pine needles, sticks, rocks, but adrenaline kept us moving. We could hear it coming after us, the crashing through vegetation, branches snapping, that rhythmic thud, thud, thud of heavy footsteps, faster now. "Don't look back!" Jake shouted. But I couldn't help it. I glanced over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. In the dim moonlight filtering through the trees, I saw it, about 50 yards behind us, but closing fast. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with a bulky frame covered in what looked like matted reddish-brown hair. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, and its arms, its arms hung down past its knees, swinging as it ran. I only saw it for maybe 2 seconds before turning back to the trail, but that was enough to burn the image into my memory forever. The trail seemed 10 times longer than it had during the day. Every route was a potential trip hazard, every shadow a new terror. My lungs burned and my feet were definitely bleeding, but stopping wasn't an option. Not with that thing behind us. I don't know how long we ran, probably only 5 or 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Finally, mercifully, we saw the gravel parking lot ahead. Our car was the only one there, just as we'd left it. "Keys, keys!" Chris was screaming. Jake had them, fumbling to get them out of his pocket while running. We reached the car, and Jake hit the unlock button. We piled in, not even caring about our muddy, bleeding feet on the upholstery. Jake started the engine, and we peeled out of that parking lot, gravel flying. As we pulled away, headlights sweeping across the tree line, I saw it one more time. Standing just at the edge of the forest, partially hidden by a pine tree but clearly visible. In the harsh light, I could make out more details. Its chest was barrel-shaped, incredibly broad. Its head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders. I couldn't see a neck, and its hands, they looked more like massive mitts with wide fingers hanging at its sides. We drove in silence for the first few miles, all of us processing what had happened. Finally, Chris spoke up. "That was a fucking Bigfoot," he said, his voice shaking. "A goddamn Sasquatch." "No way," I said automatically, but my heart wasn't in the denial. I'd seen it too clearly. "Did you see how big it was?" Jake's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Nothing human moves like that. Nothing human is built like that." We spent the drive back to Jacksonville trying to rationalize what we'd seen. A bear walking on its hind legs? No, the proportions were all wrong. And bears don't run like that. A person in a suit who would be out in the middle of Okala National Forest at 2:30 in the morning in a costume. And no costume could mimic the fluid movement or the raw power we'd witnessed. By the time we got back to Jake's apartment, where we'd all meet up before the trip, it was nearly 5 in the morning. We sat in his living room, nursing beers, comparing notes on what we'd seen. We realized we'd left everything behind. The tent, our sleeping bags, backpacks, food, everything. Thousands of dollars of gear. None of us even suggested going back for it. I've spent years researching what we encountered that night. I've read countless reports of Bigfoot sightings, watched documentaries, joined forums. So many details match. The height, the reddish-brown hair, the proportions, the sounds. I've learned that Okala National Forest has a history of sightings going back decades. We made a pact not to tell anyone about what happened. Who would believe us anyway? 3 guys claiming they were chased by Bigfoot. We'd be laughed out of every room. But I know what I saw. I know what chased us through those woods. I haven't been camping since that night. Jake and Chris haven't either. Sometimes I'll wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that deep, rhythmic thumping approaching my bed. That scream still echoes in my nightmares. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, I wouldn't believe it if someone told it to me. But it happened. April 2014, Okala National Forest. Something, not human, not animal, at least not any known animal, chased us through those woods. Something intelligent enough to investigate our tent, strong enough to nearly collapse it with a single hit, and fast enough that it almost caught us despite our head start. I still have a small scar on my right foot from a deep cut I got while running that night. Every time I look at it, I'm reminded that what happened was real. That thing was real. And for all I know, it's still out there in those woods, waiting for the next group of campers who venture too far from the main trails. Story 9. I've never really told this story to anyone outside my family. They believe me, sort of, but I can see the doubt in their eyes when I bring it up. It's been 14 years since it happened, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Some things just burn themselves into your memory, you know? I was 12 years old, living with my parents in Mountain View County. If you've never been there, it's about as rural as it gets. Our closest neighbor was almost a mile away, and the nearest actual town was a 20-minute drive. We lived in this little house tucked between these massive hills, almost like small mountains. I loved it though. As a kid with endless energy, having all that wilderness as my playground was awesome. My favorite thing to do was ride my bike around the network of dirt roads that snaked through the hills. There weren't many cars out there, so my parents let me ride alone as long as I stayed on the roads and came back before dark. I had this blue mongoose bike that I thought was the coolest thing ever. I'd spend hours just riding loops, coasting downhill, then huffing and puffing to pedal back up the next one. It was late April, almost May. School was winding down, and I remember being extra excited because summer break was coming. The weather was perfect that day, not too hot, not too cold, with these puffy white clouds that didn't block the sun. I'd finished my homework early and had the whole afternoon to myself. I decided to take my usual route, which was this roughly 3-mile loop that circled around our property and through some state forest land. I knew every inch of that route, every pothole, every sharp turn, every steep section. There was this one part I loved the most, a long downhill stretch where I could just coast for almost half a mile, feeling the wind rush past my face. I was about an hour into my ride when I hit that downhill section. I remember I'd just taken a drink from my water bottle and was feeling pretty good. One thing about coasting downhill on a dirt road is that it's nearly silent, just the soft crunch of gravel under tires and the whisper of wind. As I rounded a bend about halfway down the hill, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was something on the road ahead of me, maybe 100 yards away. At first, I thought it was a bear. We had black bears in the area, and they sometimes wandered onto the roads, but something was off. It was standing upright, walking across the road on 2 legs. I immediately thought, oh, it's a bear walking on its hind legs. I'd seen videos of bears doing that before. I slowed down, squeezing my brakes gently so they wouldn't squeal. The last thing I wanted was to startle a bear. As I got closer, maybe 50 yards away now, I realized I wasn't looking at a bear. Bears don't walk like that. When bears stand on their hind legs, they're awkward, like they're constantly about to fall over. This thing was walking smoothly. Its arms weren't held out for balance. They were swinging naturally at its sides, just like a person would walk. I coasted to a near stop, my feet hovering just above the ground, ready to plant them and turn around if needed. The thing still hadn't noticed me. It was focused on crossing the road, moving from the left side to the right. It was big, really big, taller than my dad, who's 6 feet tall and much broader. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. The thing that really struck me was how it moved. It was so fluid, natural. Like this was its normal way of getting around. There was power in every step, but also this strange grace that I can't really explain. When it reached the other side of the road, it paused at the bottom of this steep embankment. What it did next is something I'll never forget as long as I live. It reached out, not with paws but with hands, and grabbed branches from 2 different trees, one with each hand. Then it pulled itself up the steep slope with this incredible strength, like the incline was nothing. I was close enough now, maybe 30 yards away, to see details that made my blood run cold. It was covered in hair, not fur like a bear, but hair that hung and swayed with its movements. The hair was a dark chocolate brown color with these reddish highlights where the sun hit it. And underneath all that hair, I could see muscles moving and flexing, powerful shoulders, a back that tapered to a narrower waist, thick legs. I was completely frozen. I wasn't breathing. I wasn't blinking. I was just watching. The whole thing probably lasted less than a minute, but it felt like time had stopped. The creature never made a sound, no grunts, no breathing, nothing, and it never looked in my direction. If it had seen me, I don't even want to think about that. When it disappeared over the top of the embankment, the spell broke. Suddenly I could move again, and all I could think was, get home now. I put my feet down, spun my bike around so fast I nearly fell, and started pedaling like my life depended on it. Going uphill against the slope I'd just coasted down, I didn't care. My legs burned and my lungs felt like they were going to explode, but pure fear kept me going. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced it was going to come charging down the hill after me. Every rustle in the trees made me pedal harder. By the time I got home, my shirt was soaked with sweat, and I was shaking so bad I could barely get off my bike. I burst through the front door, probably looking like I'd seen a ghost. My mum was in the kitchen and immediately knew something was wrong. "Tyler, what happened? Are you okay?" she asked, rushing over to me. I tried to explain, but the words came out all jumbled. There was, on the road, it wasn't a bear. It was walking. It had hands. I was hyperventilating, pointing back toward the direction I'd come from. My dad came in from the garage, heard me freaking out and sat me down at the kitchen table. He got me a glass of water and told me to take deep breaths. When I calmed down enough to speak clearly, I told them everything I'd seen. Every detail was still crystal clear in my mind. They exchanged this look I'll never forget. It wasn't disbelief exactly, but concern. My dad asked, "Are you sure it wasn't just a bear? They can look strange from certain angles." "Dad, it wasn't a bear," I insisted. "Bears don't have hands that can grab branches from different trees. Bears don't have hair that swings when they move. It walked like a person, but it wasn't a person. It was too big, too different." My mum suggested it might have been a hiker in bulky clothes, maybe a backpacker with a large pack. But that didn't make sense either. No one wears a full-body hairsuit to go hiking, and no backpack looks like a naturally tapered back with moving muscles. My dad, trying to be practical, said, "Well, let's drive down there and take a look." I didn't want to go back, but I also wanted to prove I wasn't making this up. So we got in his pickup truck and drove down to where I'd seen the creature. Of course, by the time we got there, it was long gone. My dad examined the area where it had crossed the road, looking for tracks, but the ground was too hard and rocky to show clear footprints. He did find some broken branches on the embankment, but that could have been anything. "If it was a Sasquatch, it's gone now," he said, trying to sound reassuring but looking uneasy himself. I could tell he was humoring me, but also not completely dismissing what I'd seen. My dad grew up in those mountains and had heard stories all his life. I didn't ride my bike alone for the rest of that summer. When school started again in the fall, some of my confidence had returned, but I always took different routes, avoiding that particular stretch of road. I'd lie awake at night, replaying the encounter in my mind, second-guessing what I'd seen. Was it really what I thought it was? Could it have been something else? But 14 years later, I still can't explain it away. I know what I saw wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. No costume moves that naturally or shows muscles flexing underneath. And who would be out in the middle of nowhere in a costume anyway? What stands out most in my memory is the complete silence of the encounter. It never knew I was there. I was witnessing something that wasn't meant to be seen. A creature going about its business in what it thought was solitude. There was something almost intimate about it, like I'd accidentally walked in on someone changing clothes. I've read about Sasquatch encounters since then, trying to make sense of what I saw. Some accounts match mine so closely it gives me chills. The fluid walking motion, the way they use their hands, the silent, deliberate movements. I know how crazy it sounds. If someone told me this story, I'd probably think they were exaggerating or confused. But I know what I saw, Sometimes when I'm driving through wooded areas, I catch myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that dark figure again. I've never gone back to that exact spot, even though my parents still live in the same house. Some memories are better left undisturbed. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but it happened. On a perfectly normal April afternoon, on a dirt road I'd ridden 100 times before, I saw something that shouldn't exist, and nothing anyone says can convince me otherwise. Sometimes I wonder where it is now, if it's still out there moving silently through the forests of Mountain View County. And sometimes, on quiet nights when I can't sleep, I wonder if it ever thinks about the skinny kid on a blue bike who accidentally glimpsed its world for just a moment before speeding away. Story 10. I've been holding this in for so long that it's actually a relief to finally write it down. I guess I need to get this off my chest after all these years. What happened that night in 1991 has stayed with me, and I've only told a handful of people who were close to me. Most gave me that look, you know the one, where they're trying to figure out if I'm pulling their leg or if I've lost my mind. It was early fall, around mid-October. I remember because the weather had turned and Halloween decorations were starting to pop up everywhere. I was driving south on Interstate 5, heading toward Roseburg. My job at the time had me traveling a lot between Portland and Northern California, and I was used to making these late-night drives when traffic was light. That night, it was about 2:30 in the morning. The stretch of highway near Rice Hill is pretty isolated, especially at that hour. It had been raining earlier, and there was still a light mist in the air that made the road glisten under my headlights. I had the radio on low, some late-night talk show that was more background noise than anything I was actually listening to. My coffee from the last rest stop was getting cold in the cup holder. I was the only one on the road as far as I could tell. No headlights behind me, none ahead. Just me and the darkness and the wet pavement. I was going about 65 miles per hour, which was the speed limit back then. I was alert. I've always been a good night driver, but I was on autopilot, just watching the white lines and the reflectors embedded in the road. When you're driving a route you know well, your mind sort of settles into this groove, where you're aware, but not really thinking. That's where I was when I started ascending Rice Hill. For those who don't know the area, it's this steep climb that curves around, and then you crest the hill, and the road transitions from heading west to heading south as you start to descend. I remember adjusting my grip on the steering wheel as I reached the top of the hill. The highway there has these guardrails on the right side because of the steep drop-off beyond them. My headlights swept across the road as I navigated the curve, and that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape crouched down beside the guardrail on the right side of the road. My initial thought was that it might be a deer or maybe someone having car trouble, though I hadn't passed any stopped vehicles. But as my headlights fully illuminated the figure, it reacted to the light in a way that made my blood run cold. It stood up, fast, not like a person who's been kneeling and needs to straighten their back or stretch. This thing unfolded in one fluid motion, like it had springs for joints. In the span of maybe 2 seconds, it went from crouching to standing fully upright, and it was big, not gigantic like you hear in some stories, but substantial, solid. What happened next is what I replay in my mind over and over. This thing took 1, maybe 2 steps toward the guardrail, not rushing, just deliberate, and then jumped. Not climbed, not scrambled, it jumped clear over that guardrail like it was stepping over a garden hose. Just gone, down the embankment. I hit the brakes. Not panic braking, but firm enough that I felt the car nose down as it slowed. I pulled over to the shoulder about 50 yards past, where I'd seen the figure. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my hands were shaking on the wheel. I sat there for a minute with the engine running, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. I've been an outdoorsman all my life. Grew up hunting with my dad in these same mountains. I know what bears look like, what they move like. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand like that, and they sure as hell don't leap over guardrails with that kind of agility. What I saw was upright, bipedal. It had this dark brown, shaggy hair covering its body. Not fur exactly, more like long hair that moved with it. The arms were what struck me. They were long, way out of proportion to what you'd expect on a human. And there was no visible neck, just this head that seemed to sit directly on these massive shoulders. I had my .44 Magnum in the glove compartment. I always carried it on these long drives for protection, and for a brief moment I considered grabbing it and going to investigate. But something stopped me. Call it instinct or self-preservation, but every fiber of my being was telling me to stay in the car, that whatever was out there was something I didn't want to encounter up close. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes debating what to do. The rational part of my brain was trying to come up with explanations. Maybe it was someone in a costume. It was close to Halloween after all. But who would be out on a remote highway at 2:30 in the morning wearing a costume? And no costume I've ever seen moves like that or has those proportions. The way it moved wasn't human. It wasn't awkward or stilted like someone in a suit. It moved naturally, with purpose, like it belonged in that body. The image that kept coming to mind, and I know how this sounds, was Chewbacca from Star Wars. Not that it looked exactly like that, but it had that same kind of build. Big shoulders, thick hair, upright and humanoid, but definitely not human. I didn't get a clear look at its face. Mostly what I saw was its back and a partial left profile as it turned to jump. I couldn't make out facial features in that brief moment, just the general shape of its head and body. Eventually, I put the car back in drive and continued on my way, constantly checking my rearview mirror. I was half expecting to see it again, maybe running alongside the road or crossing behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty highway stretching out behind me. The rest of the drive to Roseburg was a blur. I was so amped up on adrenaline that I couldn't have fallen asleep if I'd tried. My mind kept replaying those few seconds, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. By the time I checked into a motel in Roseburg, I was exhausted but still too wired to sleep. The next morning, in the harsh light of day, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd been more tired than I thought. Maybe it was a trick of the light, shadows playing on the guardrail, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a hallucination or a misidentification. It was real, solid, and it moved with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. I thought about driving back up to Rice Hill that day to look for tracks or some other evidence, but I talked myself out of it. What would I even be looking for? The embankment there is steep and wooded. Whatever I saw could have been miles away by then, and honestly, part of me didn't want to find anything. There's comfort in uncertainty sometimes. When I finally told my brother about it a week later, he suggested I report it to one of those Bigfoot research groups. I considered it, but ultimately decided against it. I've seen how people who report these things get treated, like they're attention seekers or nuts, and I'm neither. I'm just a guy who saw something I can't explain. Over the years, I've read accounts from other people who've had similar experiences in that area. The Pacific Northwest has a long history of these sightings, and while I was skeptical before, I'm not anymore. There's something out there in those woods that defies conventional explanation. I'm still not sure what to call what I saw that night. Bigfoot, Sasquatch. Those names come with so much baggage and ridicule. All I know is that it was real, it was there, and then it was gone, leaving me with a story I can barely tell, without feeling like I'm going to be judged. The thing that stayed with me the most isn't just the sight of this creature, but the feeling I had in its presence. It wasn't threatening me. It was clearly trying to get away from me and my car. But there was this overwhelming sense that I had glimpsed something that wasn't supposed to be seen, something that exists in the margins of our world, in the spaces we've forgotten how to look. I still drive that stretch of I-5 sometimes, and I always slow down a bit as I approach Rice Hill. I find myself scanning the roadside, the tree line, looking for that dark figure. I haven't seen it again, and maybe part of me doesn't want to. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. But on rainy nights when I'm alone with my thoughts, I still wonder what exactly was crouched by that guardrail, what lives out there in the wilderness that we don't acknowledge or understand, and most unsettling of all, how many times has it seen us when we didn't see it? I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, if someone told me this story, I'd probably be skeptical too, but I know what I saw. It was there, it was real, and then it was gone, disappearing into the night as quickly and mysteriously as it had appeared. That moment has stayed with me for over 30 years now, crystal clear, while other memories have faded. Maybe one day I'll get an explanation that makes sense. Until then, I just live with the knowledge that there are things in this world that don't fit into our neat categories, things that remind us that for all our highways and headlights, there are still secrets in the dark. Story 11. I've debated for months whether to share this. My wife thinks I should just forget it, that talking about it only keeps it fresh in my mind. But I can't shake what happened last summer, and I need to put it out there, if only to see if anyone else has experienced anything similar. We moved to our little farm outside Paris, Tennessee, back in 2019. It's nothing fancy, just 20 acres with a modest farmhouse, a barn, and a chicken coop. We raise some goats, keep chickens, and grow vegetables. My wife Amy works in town as a nurse, and I run a small contracting business that lets me work mostly from home. Our two kids, Jake, 11, and Emma, 9, attend the local elementary school. It was our dream setup. Peaceful country, living with enough land to be self-sufficient, but still close enough to town for the necessities. The property backs up to about 800 acres of dense forest that stretches for miles. The previous owners warned us that we'd see all kinds of wildlife, deer, coyotes, foxes, the occasional black bear. We were fine with that. Part of the charm of country living, right? Everything was normal until last June 6th, 2021 to be exact. I remember the date because it was my brother's birthday, and I'd spent the afternoon on the phone with him. That evening I was locking up the barn around 9:30. It was already dark, but the moon was bright enough that I didn't bother with my flashlight. I'd just closed the main door when I heard it. This deep, dragging exhale, followed by a low growl from just inside the tree line, maybe 40 yards away. It's hard to describe that sound. It wasn't like a dog or coyote. It had this heavy, chesty quality to it, almost like someone with a really deep voice trying to clear their throat, but bigger. My first thought was maybe a bear, but we rarely get them around here, and it didn't sound right for that either. I froze for a second, then hurried back to the house, telling myself it was probably just some animal I wasn't familiar with. I mentioned it to Amy, but she was half asleep after a 12-hour shift and just mumbled something about coyotes. The next morning, I was out early to feed the animals and noticed the goat pen gate was open. The latch had been torn loose, and one of the fence posts was bent outward, like something had pushed against it with considerable force. Strangely, the goats were all accounted for, huddled together in their shelter. They seemed spooked, not coming out for their feed like they normally would. I spent a couple hours fixing the gate, telling myself it was probably just some local kids messing around, though we don't have many neighbors out this way. That night, around 1 in the morning, I was jolted awake by loud banging. It sounded like something hitting metal, coming from the direction of the barn. I got up and looked out our bedroom window, which faces the backyard. The moon was behind clouds now, so it was pretty dark, but I could hear gravel crunching, the sound of something heavy moving around near the barn. I grabbed my flashlight and was about to head downstairs when I heard Amy whisper, "What is that?" She was awake now too. Probably raccoons or something. I'm gonna check it out. I went downstairs and stepped onto the back porch. As soon as the screen door shut behind me, I heard a loud growl from the direction of our tool shed. It was the same sound from the night before, but closer and more aggressive. The hair on my neck stood up, and I retreated back inside, locking the door behind me. "What was it?" Amy asked when I got back upstairs. "Not sure. Something big. I'll check in the morning." Morning revealed the tool shed door hanging open, though I was certain I'd closed it. Inside, tools were scattered everywhere. My heavy iron rake was snapped in half, and a steel shovel was bent nearly in half. This wasn't the work of raccoons or teenagers. Whatever did this had serious strength. I called the local sheriff's office, and Deputy Wilson came out later that afternoon. He looked over the damage, took some notes, and suggested it might be black bears, though he admitted he'd never seen a bear do this kind of damage to metal tools. He promised to drive by our place on his evening patrols for the next few days. That night and the night after, the growls continued. They'd come from different positions along the tree line, never in the same spot twice. Our dog, Max, a lab mix who normally loves running the property, refused to leave the porch after dark. He'd stand there with his ears back and tail low, staring toward the woods, occasionally letting out a low whimper. On the fourth night, June 9th, things escalated. Around midnight, there was a loud slam against the barn wall, like something had struck it with force. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my spotlight, I'd upgraded from the flashlight, and ran downstairs. Amy was right behind me, telling me not to go out there. "I need to see what's damaging our property," I insisted. I stepped onto the porch and swept the beam of the spotlight toward the barn. That's when I caught movement along the trees. A huge, dark figure standing just beyond our fence line. It was upright, definitely not on all fours. Though partially obscured by brush, I could make out a massive silhouette, at least 7 feet tall. When the light hit it, the thing let out that same deep growl, then turned and walked back into the forest. Not ran, walked, on 2 legs. I stood there shaking, unable to process what I'd just seen. I went back inside and found Amy standing in the kitchen, face pale. "Did you see that?" I asked. "I saw something big move into the trees. What the hell was it?" "I don't know." We barely slept that night. In the morning, I found more destruction. A wooden sawhorse I kept near the barn was shattered into pieces. Several tools were tossed around and bent near the fence line. Our tomato plants had been trampled, and the trellis stakes were pulled completely out of the ground. I took photos of everything and called Deputy Wilson again. He came out, looked at the damage and the photos, but didn't have much to offer. "Could be vandals," he suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "At this point, I'm thinking of setting up some game cameras," I told him. Not a bad idea. Story 12. I still don't know what to make of what I found that day. It's been 14 years, and I've told this story to maybe 5 people total. Most just give me that look, you know the one, the "this guy's lost it" look. I'm a rational person. I'm a doctor, for God's sake. I deal in evidence and diagnosis. But what I saw in those woods defies any logical explanation I can come up with. It was Friday, March 13th, 2009. I remember the date clearly because I joked with my receptionist about it being Friday the 13th before leaving my practice in Santa Monica for a long weekend. I'd been working 60-hour weeks for months and needed to clear my head. I've always found solitude in nature helps reset my mental state. So I decided to drive up to Northern California, to Siskiyou County specifically. The drive was long but therapeutic. I left early Thursday evening after my last patient and drove through the night, stopping only for coffee and gas. By early morning, I'd made it to Mount Shasta and found a motel to crash for a few hours. After some rest, I grabbed breakfast at a local diner where I overheard some locals talking about Indian Creek Road having just been cleared after some late-season snow. Perfect, I thought. I'd explore there. I loaded up my SUV with my day pack, water, trail mix, basic first aid, force of habit, my camera and binoculars. The temperature was in the low 40s that morning, cold but manageable with my down jacket. I drove up Indian Creek Road, watching the elevation tick up on my GPS. Around 3,500 feet, I hit the snow line. Nothing too deep, just a couple inches of slushy spring snow covering the ground. I parked at a small turnout where the plows had stopped. There was nobody else around, exactly what I needed. The silence was immediate and absolute when I stepped out of the car. Just the sound of melting snow dripping from pine branches and the occasional bird call. I remember taking a deep breath and feeling the tension leave my shoulders. I followed what looked like a game trail into the woods, not planning to go far, just wanting to stretch my legs and maybe spot some wildlife. About 20 minutes in, I came across some bear tracks, big ones. They were fresh, maybe from earlier that morning. I'm no wildlife expert, but I know enough to be cautious. I took a few photos, thinking it was interesting that not all bears were hibernating yet. The tracks continued parallel to my path for a while, before veering off deeper into the forest. After about 45 minutes of hiking, I reached a small clearing where the snow was more intact, less disturbed by the tree cover. That's when I saw them, the first set of tracks. I initially thought they were human tracks, but something was off. They were huge. I'm not exaggerating when I say they were at least 16 inches long. My first thought was that someone was playing a prank, wearing those fake Bigfoot feet you can buy online, but these didn't look fake. The impressions in the snow showed weight distribution and subtle toe movements that would be nearly impossible to fake. I knelt down to examine them closer. 5 toes, clearly defined, a massive arch, a depth that suggested something very heavy had made them. I placed my hiking boot next to one for scale and took a photo. My size 11 boot looked like a child's shoe in comparison. That's when I noticed the second set of tracks. At first, I thought maybe a normal-sized person was walking alongside whoever or whatever made the large prints, but no. These were tiny, about 5 inches long, with 5 clearly defined toes, like miniature versions of the large tracks. The pattern was what struck me most. The large tracks had a shorter stride where they ran alongside the small tracks, as if deliberately slowing down. In some places, the large tracks were close together, almost side by side, while the small tracks continued forward. It was exactly how a parent would stand still while holding a child's hand, letting them walk ahead a bit. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I was looking at what appeared to be an adult and child of something not human. My scientific mind immediately began working through alternatives, perhaps a bear walking on hind legs with a cub. No, these were clearly bipedal tracks with distinct human-like feet. A hoax? Possibly. But who would go to such elaborate lengths in this remote area with no audience? And the subtle details in the impressions, the way the weight shifted, the clear toe marks, seemed impossible to fake convincingly. I followed the tracks, taking photos every few yards. The story they told became increasingly clear. The large creature was teaching the small one to walk. In some sections, the small tracks disappeared entirely for several yards before reappearing, suggesting the adult had picked up the child when it got tired. The tracks led me deeper into the forest than I'd planned to go. I checked my watch. I'd been following them for almost an hour. The snow was getting deeper and the tree cover thicker. I should have turned back, but my curiosity was overwhelming. That's when I heard it. A sound I still can't adequately describe. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a hum, something between a deep rumble and what almost sounded like speech, but no language I'd ever heard. It came from ahead of me, maybe 100 yards through the trees. I froze. The rational part of my brain said to leave immediately, but I'd come this far. I needed to see. I moved forward as quietly as possible, crouching behind trees, stopping frequently to listen. The sound didn't repeat, but I could hear movement ahead, branches breaking, the soft crunch of snow. I reached for my camera, making sure it was ready. My hands were shaking, partly from cold, mostly from adrenaline. I moved forward a few more yards and found myself at the edge of another small clearing. The tracks led directly across it and into a dense thicket on the other side. That's when I saw movement in the thicket. Something large shifting behind the branches. I raised my camera, but before I could focus, a massive shadow moved with surprising speed deeper into the forest. I caught only a glimpse, dark, upright, at least 7 feet tall. Then it was gone. I stood there, paralyzed. My medical training includes keeping calm in emergencies, but this was different. This was primal fear mixed with scientific disbelief. I wanted to follow, to see more clearly what I'd glimpsed, but self-preservation finally kicked in. Whatever it was faster and stronger than me, and it knew I was there. I turned to head back the way I came and nearly tripped over a freshly broken branch on the ground. It was thick, about 4 inches in diameter, snapped like a twig. I'm a fit guy, but I couldn't break a branch that size without tools. The break was fresh, the exposed wood still light-colored and damp. I hurried back along the tracks, constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest that had seemed so peaceful earlier now felt oppressive, like every shadow might hide something watching me. I moved as quickly as I could without running, not wanting to trigger any predatory instinct if I was being followed. About halfway back to my car, I noticed something odd about the bear tracks I'd seen earlier. They crossed paths with the large bipedal tracks, and where they did, the bear tracks changed direction, moving away from the other tracks. Even a large predator had avoided whatever made those footprints. When I finally reached my car, I was drenched in sweat, despite the cold. I fumbled with my keys, started the engine, and sat there for several minutes with the heater blasting, trying to process what I'd seen. I drove straight back to my motel, uploaded the photos to my laptop, and examined them for hours. The images were clear. These weren't bear tracks, weren't human tracks, weren't anything I could identify. The size difference between the adult and child prints was proportional to human adults and children, but on a much larger scale. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying that glimpse of movement in my mind, trying to convince myself it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. But bears don't walk bipedally for extended distances. They don't have feet with 5 distinct toes that leave human-like prints, and they certainly don't teach their young to walk while holding their hands. In the morning, I considered reporting what I'd found to local authorities or the Forest Service. But what would I say? That I'd found Bigfoot tracks, that I'd seen a Sasquatch parent teaching its child to walk? I'm a respected physician. I couldn't risk my reputation on something so outlandish. Even though I knew what I'd seen, I did drive back to the area that day, intending to show someone else, to have a witness. But overnight rain had washed away most of the snow at the lower elevations, and with it, any clear evidence of the tracks. All that remained were indistinct depressions in the muddy ground that could have been anything. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw that day. I've read everything I can find about Sasquatch sightings, about animal tracks, about pareidolia, and how the human mind seeks patterns. I've spoken with a wildlife biologist friend, showing him the photos without telling him where they were taken or what I thought they were. His response was unsettling. These appear to be primate tracks, but nothing native to North America. I still have the photos stored on an external hard drive that I rarely access. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress of overwork had caused some kind of temporary break with reality. But then I look at those images again, at the clear impressions in the snow, at the undeniable pattern of an adult slowing its pace to accommodate a child, at places where the adult clearly stood still while the child walked ahead. I know what I saw, I just don't know what it means. And to this day, whenever I hear about Sasquatch sightings, I don't laugh or dismiss them like I once would have, because for a few hours on a cold March day in 2009, I walked in the footsteps of something that shouldn't exist, but undeniably does. Idgundio, Story 13. Basadi, this happened in October of last year, 2022. I'd been planning a solo backpacking trip in Oregon for months. I love hiking, always have, and I'd heard the Cioslaw National Forest west of Triangle Lake was beautiful in fall. The weather forecast looked good, cool but not cold, minimal chance of rain, perfect hiking conditions. I packed light, just my one-person tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, water filter, first aid kit, the usual stuff. I left my car at a small pull-off near an old logging road and hiked in about 6 miles to set up camp near a small clearing I'd found on the map. Everything was normal that first day. The forest was gorgeous, all those deep greens and browns with splashes of fall color. I set up my tent before sunset, made dinner on my little camp stove, and settled in for the night. I remember feeling so peaceful, listening to the forest sounds as I drifted off. It was around midnight when I first noticed something was off. I woke up because it had gotten unnaturally quiet. No insects, no wind, nothing. And there was this fog that had rolled in, thick, almost opaque. I could barely see the trees 15 feet from my tent. I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining to hear anything. That's when the footsteps started, heavy, deliberate, circling my tent. At first I thought maybe it was a deer or elk, but the steps were too heavy, too purposeful, and they were bipedal, not four-legged. Something was walking around my tent on 2 feet. I reached for my flashlight but hesitated. Some instinct told me to stay quiet, to not draw attention, so I just sat there, barely breathing, listening to whatever it was circling me. Then I heard it, this low grunt that sent ice through my veins. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd heard before, not a bear, not a cougar, nothing I could identify. It was deep and resonant, almost like it came from a massive chest cavity. The footsteps continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes. Then they receded into the forest. I didn't sleep at all the rest of that night. I just sat there, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, waiting for whatever it was to come back. By morning, the fog hadn't lifted. If anything, it was thicker. I packed up as quickly and quietly as I could, hands shaking the whole time. I kept telling myself it was just a bear, even though I knew bears don't walk on 2 legs for extended periods. And that sound, that wasn't a bear. I decided to cut my trip short. The original plan was to do a loop that would take 3 days, but I figured I could take a connecting ridge trail that would get me back to the logging road in about 7 hours. I just wanted to get out of there. The fog made navigation tricky. I had to check my compass constantly, and visibility was maybe 20 feet at best. The forest felt wrong, too quiet, too still. That's when I first heard it moving through the woods beside me. It was paralleling my route, staying just out of sight in the fog. I'd hear branches breaking, undergrowth rustling, but always off to my side, never directly in my path. When I'd stop, it would stop. When I'd start walking again, so would it. This went on for about an hour. I was getting more and more freaked out, walking faster, checking over my shoulder constantly. Then it changed tactics. It started circling around me, darting between trees with a speed that didn't seem possible for something that sounded so big. It was like it was testing me, seeing how I'd react. I froze, just stood there on the trail, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. That's when it emerged from the fog. It was about 30 feet ahead of me on the trail, just standing there, watching me. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was thick, muscular, with arms that hung lower than a human's would. The shoulders were impossibly broad. The whole body was covered in this dark brown hair, not fur exactly, more like long hair that was matted down with moisture from the fog. Its head was large, slightly pointed at the top. I couldn't make out facial features clearly through the fog, but I could feel it staring at me. I've never felt so small, so vulnerable. This wasn't just an animal. There was an intelligence there, a presence. It knew exactly what it was doing. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other. Then it let out this sound, not quite a roar, more like a vibrating growl that I could feel in my chest. It took a step toward me. I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, just turned and ran as fast as I could back the way I'd come. I heard it immediately crash into pursuit behind me. The sound of it moving through the forest was terrifying, breaking branches, thumping footfalls, that awful grunting sound getting closer. It was faster than me, much faster. I knew I couldn't outrun it on the trail, so I veered off into the thick undergrowth, scrambling down a steep slope, trying to make it harder for it to follow. I slipped, fell, tumbled down part of the hillside, and somehow managed to keep going. My pack was catching on branches, slowing me down, but I was too scared to stop and take it off. I could hear it crashing down the slope behind me, the way it moved through the brush. It wasn't just powerful, it was coordinated. This wasn't blind pursuit, it was hunting me. I don't know how long I ran. Time kind of blurred, my lungs were burning, legs shaking. I crossed a small stream, scrambled up the opposite bank, and kept going. Eventually, I realized I couldn't hear it anymore. I stopped, gasping for breath, trying to listen over the pounding of my heart. Nothing, just silence and fog. I was completely lost at this point. No idea which direction the trail was, or the logging road, or anything. My map and compass were useless because I had no reference points in the fog. I just picked a direction that seemed to go uphill and started walking, hoping to find the ridge again. For hours, I wandered through that fog-choked forest, jumping at every sound, expecting that thing to appear in front of me again at any moment. I was exhausted, scratched up from branches, and soaked from sweat and from falling in that stream, but the fear kept me moving. Sometime in the afternoon, the fog finally started to thin. I climbed to higher ground and was eventually able to spot a clear-cut area in the distance that I recognized from my drive-in. I headed that way and, after another hour of careful hiking, found the logging road about 2 miles from where I'd parked. I've never been so happy to see my beat-up old truck. I threw my pack in the back and got the hell out of there, driving way too fast on that rough road, constantly checking the rearview mirror. It's been almost a year now, and I still have nightmares about it, about those eyes in the fog, the way it moved with such purpose, the way it flanked me, tested me, chased me. That wasn't random animal behavior, it was deliberate. I've spent a lot of time researching since then, reading accounts of other people who've had similar experiences in the Pacific Northwest. I know what people call these things, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, but those names seem almost silly compared to what I encountered. There was nothing funny or mythical about it. It was real, it was intelligent, and it was aggressive. The thing that haunts me most is how it circled my tent that night, like it was studying me, and how it paralleled my path the next day before cutting me off. It wasn't just randomly wandering the forest and happened to cross my path. It was tracking me, hunting me. I don't know why it didn't catch me. It easily could have. Maybe it was just trying to drive me out of its territory. Maybe it was playing with me, I don't know, and I don't want to know. I still hike, but never alone anymore, and never in that part of Oregon. Some places in this world belong to things that were here long before us, and they don't want us there. I learned that the hard way. Sometimes when it's foggy out, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams. Heavy, deliberate hunting. Story. This happened about 3 months ago. I work at the Regional Medical Center in Longview, and that particular day had been absolute hell. We were short-staffed because of a stomach bug going around, and I'd agreed to cover part of another shift. What was supposed to be my regular 12 hours turned into 19 straight hours of chaos. Multiple car accident victims, a heart attack, and a child with severe pneumonia. It was non-stop. By the time I clocked out at 1 in the morning, I was completely drained. My eyes burned from staring at charts and monitors all day. My feet ached so bad, I'd switched to my backup shoes halfway through the shift. All I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and fall into bed. The drive from Longview to my place outside Henderson is usually about 30 minutes on Highway 259. Not too bad, and I've done it a million times. The road is pretty dark, typical rural East Texas highway with trees crowding both sides and not much else. Usually, I don't mind the drive. Sometimes it's actually peaceful after a hectic shift. That night, though, there was patchy fog, which isn't unusual for that area in the spring when the day's been warm and the night cools down. Nothing terrible, just pockets of mist that made me slow down a bit in certain stretches. I had the radio on low, just to keep me company. I remember some old Eagles song was playing. Despite being exhausted, I wasn't worried about falling asleep at the wheel. 19 hours is bad, but as a nurse, I've worked worse. Your body gets used to it, and I've learned to stay alert even when tired. It's part of the job. Plus, I was only about 9 miles north of Henderson at that point, almost home. I'd just crossed over the second of 2 small creeks. There's a slight curve after that second creek, and the trees thin out a bit on the right side of the road. The fog had cleared in that stretch, which was good because my high beams were just reflecting back at me in the heavier patches. That's when I saw it. On the right shoulder, next to a cluster of pine trees, there was this figure. My headlights caught it clearly for maybe 3 seconds as I approached and passed. It was just standing there, not moving, not crossing the road, just standing, slightly turned toward the highway, like it was watching or listening for something. The first thing that hit me was the size. I'm not exaggerating when I say this thing was massive, easily 7 feet tall, maybe taller. And it wasn't just tall, it had mass to it. Broad shoulders, thick build, not like a skinny person or a deer on its hind legs. This was solid. The second thing I noticed was that it was covered in what looked like dark fur or hair. In my headlights it appeared almost black, but it could have been very dark brown. The fur wasn't short like a deer's, it was longer, shaggy almost, especially around what would be the shoulders. I couldn't make out a face. Either it wasn't fully facing me, or the face was obscured by the hair. I don't know. But I could tell by its posture that it was standing upright, completely vertical, not hunched over like a bear might be if it stood up. Here's the thing that keeps replaying in my mind. It didn't react to my car at all. It didn't move, didn't turn toward my headlights, didn't run away. It just stood there, completely still, like it was intentionally not reacting, like it didn't want to be noticed moving. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. Every instinct in my body screamed to keep going, to put distance between myself and whatever that was. My hands tightened on the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles went white. I remember glancing at my speedometer and seeing I'd unconsciously accelerated to almost 80. As I drove past, I checked my rearview mirror, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness behind me. Part of me wanted to turn around to confirm what I'd seen, but a stronger part knew that was a terrible idea. I just kept driving. The rest of the way home, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept checking my mirrors, irrationally afraid that somehow this thing would be following me. I turned the radio off because I needed to hear if there was anything around me. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in my car for a few minutes, with the doors locked, just staring at the darkness around my rural property. I live alone in a small house on about 2 acres, mostly surrounded by pine trees. It never bothered me before, but that night, those trees seemed like they could be hiding anything. I almost called 911, but what would I say? I saw a giant hairy thing standing by the road. They'd think I was hallucinating from exhaustion, or worse, that I was on something, and maybe that would have been the rational explanation. Except I know what I saw. Here's what it wasn't. It wasn't a bear. We have black bears in East Texas, but they're rare, and this was just wrong for a bear. The posture was too upright, too still. It wasn't a person in a costume. We're talking about 1:30 in the morning on a rural stretch of highway with no cars around. Who would be standing there in a costume? For what purpose? It wasn't a hunter. Hunting season was over, and anyway, hunters don't stand right next to highways in the middle of the night. It wasn't a stranded motorist. There was no car anywhere near it. I've been a nurse for 11 years. I've worked all kinds of shifts, been exhausted beyond belief, and I've never hallucinated. I've seen people who are genuinely hallucinating, and that's not what this was. This was real. I saw something that night that shouldn't exist, but it does. The next day, after I'd slept, I drove back to that spot in the daylight. I'm not sure what I expected to find. Footprints, maybe? Some sign that what I'd seen was real. There was nothing unusual there, just the shoulder of the road, some trees, ordinary forest floor, with pine needles and underbrush. I walked around for maybe 20 minutes, feeling ridiculous, before giving up. I tried researching if anyone else had seen something similar in the area. There were a few vague reports of something large being spotted in the woods around Henderson over the years, but nothing specific enough to validate what I'd experienced. For a while, I thought about setting up a trail camera near that spot. But then I asked myself, do I really want to know if I actually captured an image of whatever this was? What would I do with that information? Who would believe me? And more importantly, if this thing is real and living in those woods, do I want to draw its attention? I've changed my route home since then. It adds about 15 minutes to my drive, but I don't take Highway 259 at night anymore. I've told exactly 2 people about this. My sister, who was concerned and suggested I was just overtired, and my friend Mark, who's always been into cryptid stories and was way too excited about the possibility that I'd seen a Bigfoot. That's the word I've been avoiding because it sounds so ridiculous. Bigfoot, Sasquatch. But what else fits what I saw? A 7-foot-tall, fur-covered humanoid figure standing motionless in the East Texas woods in the middle of the night. I don't have a better explanation. Sometimes I try to convince myself it didn't happen, that maybe I nodded off for a second and dreamed the whole thing. But I know that's not true. I was alert. I saw it clearly in my headlights. It was real. The weirdest part of all this is how it's changed my perspective on things. I used to think people who claimed to see unexplainable things were either attention-seeking or confused. Now I just wonder how many of them are like me, normal, rational people who experience something they can't explain and can barely bring themselves to talk about because they know how it sounds. I still work the same shifts at the hospital. I still drive home alone at night, but now I watch the tree lines more carefully. I listen more intently to sounds outside my house. I've started keeping my blinds closed after dark. Whatever I saw that night changed something fundamental about how I understand the world. There are things out there we don't have explanations for, things that exist in the margins of our awareness. I never asked to know that, but now I do, and I can't unknow it. Maybe the strangest thing is that I'm not sure if I want to see it again. Part of me needs confirmation, needs to know I'm not crazy, but a larger part hopes I never encounter whatever it was for as long as I live. The forest behind my house seems different now. When I sit on my back porch in the evening, I can't help but scan the tree line, wondering if something is watching me from the shadows. Sometimes I think I hear heavy footsteps in the woods at night, but it could just be deer or wild hogs. At least that's what I tell myself. I don't know what else to say about it. I saw something impossible, something that shouldn't exist according to everything I was taught to believe, but it was there, standing on the side of Highway 259, watching the road in the middle of the night. And no matter how many times I question my own sanity or try to explain it away, I know what I saw. Story 15. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that day in July 1999. It's been over 20 years, but sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat thinking about what my brothers and I saw in those woods in Potter County. I was 14 at the time. My younger brothers, Matt and Kyle, were 12 and 10. We lived in a rural part of Pennsylvania where everyone knew everyone, and kids could still ride their bikes all over without parents freaking out. Our house was at the edge of town, and beyond our backyard stretched miles of dense forest with hiking trails, old logging roads, and a creek that was perfect for summer adventures. That day was hot as hell, probably in the 90s. Our parents were both at work, and we were bored out of our minds. The three of us decided to grab our bikes and head to Beaver Creek, about 2 miles from our house. We'd been there dozens of times before. It was our go-to spot for catching crayfish and skipping rocks. The ride there was nothing unusual. We followed the dirt path that wound through the woods, racing each other and jumping over roots and rocks like we always did. It was around 2 in the afternoon when we reached the old wooden bridge that crossed over the creek. It wasn't much of a bridge, just some weathered planks that had been there since before we were born. We usually crossed it and continued to a shallow part of the creek where we could wade, but that day we decided to take a break on the bridge first. We straddled our bikes, drinking from our water bottles and arguing about stupid stuff like whether Batman could beat Superman in a fight. I remember the sound of the creek flowing beneath us and cicadas buzzing in the trees. It was peaceful. That's when Matt noticed something. "Hey, look at that tree over there," he said, pointing to a massive oak that stood alone in a small clearing about 300 feet away. "Something's moving in it." At first, I thought it was just a squirrel or maybe a raccoon, but as I focused on the movement, I realized whatever was in that tree was way too big to be either of those. "What the hell is that?" Kyle asked, squinting against the sunlight filtering through the leaves. We all went quiet, watching intently. What we saw still doesn't make any sense, even after all these years of trying to rationalize it. There was something climbing around in that tree that looked about the size of a chimpanzee, maybe 4 feet tall. It was covered in dark brown hair, almost like a chocolate color, and it moved through the branches with incredible ease. Not like a bear cub, which would have been clumsy. This thing was agile, swinging from branch to branch, using its long arms to grab hold and propel itself around. "Is that a monkey?" Kyle whispered, though I don't know why he was whispering. We were too far away for anything to hear us. "There aren't any monkeys in Pennsylvania, dumbass," Matt replied, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We sat there frozen on our bikes, watching this thing play in the tree. It would climb up to a high branch, then swing down to a lower one, moving in circles around the trunk. I couldn't make out its face clearly. We were too far away and it was moving too much, but I could see its body silhouetted against the sky. It had proportions similar to a human but with longer arms. Its body looked solid and muscular, not lanky like a monkey's. For about 5 minutes we just watched, completely mesmerized. I remember thinking how weird it was that we weren't more freaked out. It was like watching something at the zoo. Fascinating, but separated from reality somehow. Then something changed. I can't explain it, but a feeling washed over me. It started at the base of my spine and crawled up to my neck. This overwhelming sense that we were in danger. There was no reason for it. The creature hadn't noticed us or done anything threatening. It was just this sudden primal fear that hit me out of nowhere. "We need to go," I said abruptly, surprising even myself with the urgency in my voice. "Now." Matt looked at me like I was crazy. "Why? This is awesome." "I don't know. We just need to go." I couldn't articulate why, but the feeling was getting stronger. It felt like we were being watched. Not just by the thing in the tree, but by something else. "Come on," I insisted, already turning my bike around. "Mom's going to be pissed if we're not back soon." It was a lame excuse. We both knew our mom wouldn't be home for hours, but I needed some reason to get us out of there. Kyle, being the youngest, usually followed my lead without question, and this time was no different. He immediately turned his bike around. Matt hesitated, looking back at the tree one more time, before reluctantly following. We started pedaling back up the trail toward home. I was in front, pushing hard on the pedals, wanting to put as much distance between us and that tree as possible. Kyle was right behind me, but Matt was lagging a bit, probably still annoyed that I'd cut our observations short. We'd gone maybe a quarter mile when I heard Matt yell from behind us, "Go faster! Go faster!" There was real panic in his voice. I looked back and saw him pedaling like crazy, his face pale with fear. "There's someone chasing me!" he screamed. "That's all I needed to hear." I started pedaling as hard as I could, my legs burning with the effort. The trail was uphill on the way back, making it even harder. I could hear Kyle breathing heavily behind me and Matt's bike crunching over leaves and sticks as he caught up to us. We didn't stop or slow down until we reached the edge of our yard. We dropped our bikes in the grass and collapsed next to them, all of us gasping for air. Matt's face was streaked with tears, and he was shaking. "What happened?" I asked, once I could speak again. "What was chasing you?" Matt shook his head, like he couldn't find the words. "I don't know," he finally said. I was looking back at the tree, trying to see if that thing was still there, and then I saw something else behind me on the trail. "What do you mean, something else?" Kyle asked, his eyes wide. "It was like a hairy man," Matt said, his voice cracking. "But not a man. It was huge, way bigger than the thing in the tree. It was standing between two big trees just watching me, and then it started moving toward me." "What did it look like?" I asked, feeling that same cold fear creeping back up my spine. "It was tall, taller than Dad, and Dad's 6'2". It had really dark hair all over, almost black, not brown like the smaller one, and it was thick. Like, not fat, but solid. I couldn't see its face because as soon as I saw it, I just started pedaling as hard as I could. We sat in silence for a minute, processing what Matt had said. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to tell him he was seeing things because we were all worked up about the creature in the tree. But I knew my brother. He wasn't the type to make stuff up, and he definitely wasn't the type to cry over nothing. "Do you think it was going to hurt you?" Kyle asked in a small voice. Matt shrugged. "I don't know. It didn't chase me very far, but the way it was watching me, it felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there." We eventually went inside and tried to distract ourselves with video games, but we were all on edge. We didn't tell our parents when they got home. What would we say? That we saw a monkey in a tree and then a giant hairy man in the woods. They'd think we were making it up, or that we'd been smoking something we shouldn't have. We never went back to that creek for the rest of the summer. We found other places to ride our bikes and catch crayfish. Sometimes one of us would bring it up when we were alone, trying to make sense of what we'd seen, but we never came to any satisfying conclusions. It wasn't until years later, when I was in college, that I started researching and came across accounts of Bigfoot sightings. Many described creatures that matched what we saw: the height, the build, the hair color. Some reports even mentioned younger, smaller Sasquatches accompanying larger ones. That's when it clicked for me. What if what we saw in the tree that day was a young Bigfoot? Maybe it was playing, climbing around like a kid would, and maybe the larger one Matt saw was its parent or a guardian of some kind, checking us out because we were too close to the younger one. It would explain why I suddenly felt afraid while watching the tree. Maybe the adult had been nearby the whole time, watching us watch its child. Maybe it only revealed itself when we started to leave, making sure we were actually going. I've tried to rationalize it in other ways over the years. Maybe it was a bear cub in the tree, though I've never seen a bear move the way that creature did. Maybe what Matt saw was just a hiker wearing dark clothes. But neither of those explanations feels right. The most convincing piece of evidence for me is that feeling of fear that came out of nowhere. I've been afraid plenty of times in my life, but nothing has ever felt like that. That instinctual, deep in your bones certainty that you're in danger. It wasn't something I reasoned my way into. It was something my body knew before my mind did. I've gone back to Potter County a few times as an adult, though never to that specific creek. Part of me is curious to see if those creatures are still there, but a bigger part of me doesn't want to find out. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, but sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night and hear a branch scrape against my window, I'm instantly transported back to that day on the bridge. I see that dark shape moving through the tree with impossible grace, and I feel that inexplicable fear creeping up my spine again. and I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed just a little bit longer. Story 16. I've never really told this story in full before. I'm 45 years old now, but I still wake up in cold sweats sometimes thinking about what happened in the Trinity Alps back in February of 1977. My palms are already getting sweaty just typing this out. I was 17 back then. Me and my buddy Carl decided to go on a backpacking trip with his two older brothers, Mike and Steve, plus their 12-year-old cousin Danny. We were all from Southern California, typical suburban kids who thought we were pretty tough and outdoorsy because we'd done some camping in state parks. Man, were we wrong. We loaded up 2 Volkswagen buses with our gear, tents, sleeping bags, fishing poles, a couple of .22 rifles for target shooting, and enough food for 5 days. Mike drove one bus with Danny, while Steve drove the other with me and Carl. The plan was to hit the Trinity Alps wilderness area near Mount Shasta. We'd heard it was beautiful, remote, and had good fishing. It was about a 10-hour drive from our homes in SoCal. The drive up was uneventful. We stopped for burgers, made stupid jokes, talked about girls, typical teenage stuff. I remember feeling so free, like we were having this great adventure. When we got closer to Mount Shasta, the scenery changed dramatically. The mountains were covered in snow, and the forest seemed to go on forever. It was stunning, but also kind of intimidating. I'd never seen wilderness that dense and vast before. We followed our map to a turnoff from the main highway onto a dirt road. After bouncing along for maybe 10 or 15 miles, we came around a bend and had to slow down for an old Volkswagen Beetle coming the other way. The guy driving it pulled over, so we stopped too. He rolled down his window, and I still remember how he looked. Probably mid to late 20s with a scruffy beard, flannel shirt, kind of outdoorsy. But what struck me was his eyes. He seemed really on edge, kept looking past us up the road like he was expecting someone to be following him. "You guys heading up to camp?" he asked. Steve told him, "Yeah, we were looking for a good spot near the river. Fish are biting good up there," the guy said, but he didn't sound excited about it. He drummed his fingers on his steering wheel, then added, "Be careful though," before rolling up his window and taking off down the road. Carl laughed it off. "What's that supposed to mean? Watch out for bears." But something about that interaction felt off. The guy was too nervous, too eager to get away from that area. I remember thinking maybe he'd had a run-in with a ranger for fishing without a license or something. We continued up the road until we found a campground next to a river. It was completely deserted, not another soul around, which wasn't surprising for February in Northern California. We parked the buses about 20 feet apart near the river with a fire pit between them. After setting up camp, we built a fire and cooked some hot dogs for dinner. The next day, we decided to do some exploring. We packed day packs with lunch, water, and some basic supplies, then hiked about 5 miles up into the hills. Around mid-afternoon, we stumbled across this old abandoned cabin. It was small, maybe just one room, with a collapsed roof on one side. We poked around it for a while, wondering who had lived there and why they'd left. By then, it was getting late, and we realized we wouldn't make it back to our main camp before dark. Rather than risk hiking in the dark, we decided to camp right there. We didn't have our tents, but the weather seemed clear, so we just laid out our sleeping bags under the stars. That night was brutally cold. I'd never experienced anything like it. The temperature must have dropped to the teens or lower. I woke up with frost covering my sleeping bag, and my boots had frozen solid. We all huddled together for warmth, and none of us got much sleep. At first light, we packed up and headed back to the main camp, our breath making clouds in the freezing air. When we got back to camp, we were exhausted. We spent the rest of the day just relaxing, doing a little fishing in the river, though we didn't catch anything, and taking turns target shooting with the .22s at cans we'd set up on a log about 50 yards away. Mike had brought his German Shepherd, Rex, who spent the day running around the camp and swimming in the river. After dinner, We sat around the fire telling ghost stories until about 9:30 or 10. Then we turned in for the night. Carl, Danny and I were in one bus, while Mike and Steve took the other one with Rex. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, listening to the sound of the river and thinking how peaceful it was. That's when everything changed. I'd just started to drift off when I heard something moving through the woods up on the hill above our camp. At first, I thought it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon. But then the sound changed. It was moving fast, really fast, like something running down the hill toward us. Before I could even sit up, there was a massive thud against the side of our bus. Then, the entire vehicle started rocking violently back and forth. It wasn't just shaking, it felt like someone was physically lifting one side of the bus off the ground and dropping it. We were tipping so far that I thought we were going to roll over. Danny started screaming. Carl and I both dove to the floor of the bus. I could hear the metal creaking and the windows rattling. Outside, I heard heavy, fast movement around the campsite. And then Mike yelling from the other bus. Rex was barking like crazy, making this high-pitched sound I'd never heard him make before. Not angry, but terrified. The rocking was so violent that stuff was falling off the counters and shelves inside the bus. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like forever. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We stayed frozen on the floor of the bus for what seemed like ages. Nobody wanted to look outside. Finally, Carl whispered, "What the hell was that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. From the other bus, we heard Mike call out, "Is everyone okay?" Carl managed to yell back that we were fine. After a few more minutes, Steve called out that he was going to look around with his flashlight and asked if anyone wanted to join him. None of us moved. Eventually, curiosity overcame fear. I grabbed a flashlight and Carl and I cautiously opened the door of the bus and stepped outside. Mike and Steve were already out there with their flashlights, scanning the campsite. What we saw made no sense. Our backpacks, which we'd left neatly stacked under a tarp, had been thrown all over the camp. Some were torn open, with contents scattered across the ground. Our cooking gear was strewn around the fire pit, but the strangest thing was that we couldn't find any tracks or signs of what had done this. The ground was hard-packed dirt and rock, but still, something that powerful should have left some evidence. We all slept in the same bus that night, with the doors locked and the windows closed despite the cold. Nobody talked much. We just lay there, listening for any sound outside. The next day, we debated whether to leave or stay. Steve convinced us that it was probably just some local kids messing with us, or maybe a bear looking for food, though none of our food had been touched. We spent the day cleaning up the camp and staying close together. Nobody wanted to go hiking or even fishing. That night, we turned in early. This time, all 5 of us squeezed into one bus with Rex. We left all the outside lights on and kept our rifles close by. I don't think any of us expected to sleep, but exhaustion must have taken over because I dozed off around 10. I woke up to Rex growling. His whole body was rigid and the hair on his back was standing up. That's when I heard it again, something moving on the hill above us, but this time it wasn't running. It sounded like something large walking slowly, deliberately down toward our camp. Mike whispered for everyone to stay absolutely quiet. We all sat there in the dark, hardly breathing. The footsteps stopped somewhere just at the edge of our campsite. For a long moment there was complete silence. Then wham! Something hit the back of our bus with tremendous force. The whole vehicle lurched forward. Then the rocking started again. Violent, rhythmic rocking that felt like the bus was going to tip over. Rex was going crazy, barking and trying to get at the windows. Danny was crying. I remember grabbing onto the seat to keep from being thrown around. The attack lasted about 30 seconds, just like before. When it stopped, we heard heavy footsteps rapidly moving away from the camp, up the hill. It took us almost an hour to work up the courage to go outside. When we finally did, what we found was impossible to explain. There was a massive rock, at least 3 feet in diameter, wedged between the rear bumper of our bus and the tire. It looked like it had been thrown with incredible force, but the most disturbing discovery was what had happened to the other bus. It had been moved, not just a little, but about 5 feet closer to the river. 5 grown men would have struggled to push that bus on flat ground, but something had moved it across the uneven campsite. We didn't even discuss what to do next. We just started packing. Nobody wanted to say what we were all thinking, but we knew this wasn't bears or local kids. Whatever had attacked us had impossible strength, speed, and for something so large, it moved with unbelievable stealth. We drove through the night, not stopping until we reached a place called Bigfoot RV Park, of all things, about 50 miles down the highway. The irony wasn't lost on us, but nobody laughed. We crashed there for a few hours before continuing home the next day. Over the years, I've tried to make sense of what happened. We rarely talked about it afterward. It's like we had this unspoken agreement to just pretend it never happened. I think Mike told his parents we came home early because of bad weather. I'm still not sure what attacked us in those woods. All I know is that nothing human could have done what I experienced that night. The speed, the strength, the way it vanished without a trace, it defies explanation. Sometimes I think about that bearded guy in the Beetle and wonder if he knew something. Was that what he was warning us about when he told us to be careful? To this day, I've never been back to the Trinity Alps. I don't go camping anymore, and I've never told my wife the full story. Some things are better left in the past. But I still can't sleep with the windows open, and any unexplained noise outside my house at night sends me right back to that moment in the bus, paralyzed with fear, listening to something impossible moving in the darkness. Story 17. I've debated for years whether to share this. Even typing it now, my hands are shaking a bit. I'm not some attention seeker or crazy person who believes every conspiracy theory out there. I'm just a regular guy who saw something I still can't explain, and it's haunted me for over 20 years now. It happened on September 14th, 1999. That date is burned into my brain. It was a Tuesday morning, cool but clear, in southwestern British Columbia. I'd taken a few days off work to do some camping and collect firewood for the winter. Living in the Pacific Northwest means you learn to stock up before the rains really set in. I was driving along the Hope-Princeton Highway that morning, about 6 miles east of Hope. It was around 8:45 in the morning. I remember checking my watch when I pulled off the road. I found this abandoned gravel pit about 100 yards from the highway that looked perfect to park at. You could tell it hadn't been used in years. There were even some small saplings starting to grow in parts of it. My plan was simple: hike into the woods a bit, cut some wood, load up the truck, and be home by dinner. Nothing extraordinary. I'd been to this general area before, though not this exact spot. This part of BC is gorgeous. Tall trees, deep ravines, that perfect mountain forest smell, the kind of wilderness that makes you feel small. I grabbed my pack with some water, jerky, and my chainsaw, locked the truck, and started walking along this ridge that ran alongside a pretty steep gully. I wasn't planning to go down into it. It was too steep to haul wood back up anyway. I just wanted to scout the area first before deciding where to cut. I'd gone maybe 150 yards from my truck when something caught my eye below. At first I thought it might be a bear. We have plenty of black bears and the occasional grizzly in these parts. I froze and slowly crouched down. Whatever it was big, and I didn't want to startle it. From my position, I was looking down at about a 50-yard distance. The thing was at the bottom of the ravine, and it seemed to be digging or scratching at something in the bushes. Its back was turned to me, and there was vegetation partially blocking my view of its head, but I could see most of its body clearly. What struck me immediately was the color. A rich reddish brown, not the black or brown you'd expect from a bear in these parts. And the fur, God, the fur was different. It was longer and shaggier across the back, almost like a mane, but shorter on the rest of the body. It moved with purpose, not the random meandering you see with bears. I'm an experienced outdoorsman. I've hunted since I was 12, spent countless weekends in these woods. I know what bears look like, how they move. This wasn't a bear. As I watched, it shifted position, and I caught a glimpse of its hands, or paws, I guess. The underside was lighter colored, almost a pale tan compared to the reddish brown of the rest. The fingers, and yes, they looked like fingers, not a bear's claws, seemed to be moving with dexterity as it dug at whatever had its attention. I must have made some noise, maybe shifted my weight or breathed too loud, because suddenly it stopped what it was doing. It went completely still, in that way that makes the hair on your neck stand up. You know that feeling when you realize you're being sensed by something wild, that primal awareness? My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might hear that alone. I slowly, very slowly, started to back up. I didn't run. Everything in nature knows running triggers a chase. But I wasn't sticking around to get a better look either. That's when it turned. I didn't get a clear look at its face because of the vegetation, but what I did see was enough. It was massive, shoulder width, that had to be twice mine, and I'm not a small guy. The head looked almost too small for the frame, but still larger than a human's. The proportions were just wrong, not bear, not human, just wrong. I continued backing away, trying to be as quiet as possible. Then I turned and walked quickly, not running but moving with purpose, back toward my truck. Every few steps I'd glance back, this irrational fear gripping me that it would be right behind me. About halfway back to the truck, I looked again and saw it climbing the opposite slope of the ravine. This is what I can't explain, what keeps me up some nights even now. It was moving upright, on two legs. Not like a bear might do for a moment, but consistently, powerfully moving uphill on two legs. It used its arms, and they were arms, not front legs, to grab bushes and small trees, to help pull itself up the steep slope. The strength was incredible. It moved through that difficult terrain faster than I could have, and I was on level ground. And the way it moved, it was fluid, deliberate, nothing like a bear's awkward bipedal waddle. What hit me most was the silence. This thing had to weigh at least 500 pounds, maybe more, moving through brush and over loose rocks, and I couldn't hear a thing. No branches breaking, no stones tumbling down, just silent, efficient movement. I watched it reach the ridgeline on the opposite side of the gully, still upright, and disappear into a stand of lodgepole pines. One moment it was there, this impossible thing, and the next it was gone. I practically ran the rest of the way back to my truck. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice, trying to unlock the door. I got in, locked the doors, and just sat there for maybe 20 minutes trying to process what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to drive away immediately. Another part thought I should try to find tracks or evidence. In the end, fear won out. I started the truck and got back on the highway. I didn't tell anyone for weeks. I mean, what would I say? Hey, I saw Bigfoot. People would think I was crazy or attention-seeking or both. Eventually, I told my brother, who's the only one who didn't laugh it off. He suggested I report it anonymously to one of those cryptid research groups, which I did a few months later, but I never heard anything back. The thing is, I know what I saw wasn't a bear. I've spent my whole life in these woods. I know bears, their movement, their behavior, their physiology. This was something else entirely. The way it climbed, using its hands to grab, not just for balance, the proportions of its body, the deliberate, silent movement. The size. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just a bear, that memory has played tricks on me over the years. But then I remember that moment when it sensed me and went still, and how my entire body recognized the danger before my mind could even process it. That wasn't just fear of a predator. It was something deeper, more primal, the recognition of something that shouldn't exist, but does. I've gone back to those woods many times since then. Not to that exact spot. I couldn't find it again if I tried, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. But I've spent plenty of days hunting and hiking in that general area. I've never seen anything like it again. Sometimes, though, when I'm deep in the forest and it gets quiet, that special kind of quiet where even the birds stop singing, I get the feeling I'm being watched, that something is out there, moving silently through the trees just beyond my line of sight. What bothers me most, even after all these years, is not knowing. Not knowing what exactly I saw that day, not knowing if anyone would believe me if I told them the full story, not knowing if I'll ever see it again, or if I even want to. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I'm not sure I believe it myself, but I know what I saw that September morning in 1999. I saw something moving through those woods that wasn't human, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything known to science, something that moved with intelligence and purpose and an awareness of its surroundings that still chills me to think about. I don't go collecting firewood alone anymore. And when I'm in the woods, I pay much closer attention to that feeling of being watched, because whatever I saw that day, I'm certain of one thing: it saw me too. And there's something unsettling about knowing you've been seen by something that most people don't believe exists. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, in those woods east of Hope, if it remembers me the way I remember it, if it tells stories about the human it encountered that September morning, the one who backed away slowly and then disappeared into the trees. Say, Story 18. I've been debating whether to share this for almost 20 years now, but what happened to me and my family back in 2004 still haunts me, and maybe writing it down will help me process it. I've never been one to believe in monsters or cryptids or whatever you want to call them. I was just a regular guy trying to provide for my family in rural Montana. Now I'm not so sure what to believe. It was early October of 2004. We lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Jordan, Montana, not exactly a booming metropolis. Our property backed up to a wooded area that stretched for miles. Nothing dense like you'd find in the Pacific Northwest, but enough trees and brush to create shadows and hiding places. That evening started like any other. The air had that crisp fall feeling, temperature dropping as the sun went down. With winter approaching, I was gathering firewood near the edge of our property. My two kids, Emily, 9, and Jake, 7, were helping, which mostly meant poking sticks in the dirt while our golden retriever, Buddy, bounded around them. As dusk settled in, I noticed how quickly the light was fading. "Time to head in, guys," I called out. Emily groaned but started walking back. Jake was still trying to get Buddy to fetch a stick. "Jake, come on, it's getting dark." "5 more minutes, Dad." "No, Buddy, Mom's got dinner ready and it's getting cold out here." I watched them trudge back toward the house with Buddy, following reluctantly. I decided to gather a few more pieces of wood before heading in myself. The yard light had automatically clicked on, casting a pale glow across our backyard. I figured I had enough light to work with for another 15 minutes. After loading my arms with split logs, I started walking back along the gravel road that curved around from our woodpile to the house. That's when I felt it, a strange stillness. The normal evening sounds, crickets, distant cows, the neighbor's dog, all seemed to vanish at once. The silence was so sudden it made me pause, and then I saw it. About 10 feet ahead of me on the path stood a massive dark figure, completely blocking the yard light from my view. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it, a bear standing upright. But we rarely got bears in this area, and this was different. The silhouette was unmistakably humanoid, but enormous. I'm 6'1", and this thing towered over me by at least 2 feet. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, its arms hanging longer than any humans should. The firewood tumbled from my arms, clattering onto the gravel. Neither of us moved. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only about 10 seconds, we just stood there staring at each other. I couldn't make out facial features in the darkness, just the massive outline against my yard light. Then it moved. Not slowly or cautiously, but with surprising speed for something so large. It stepped sideways into the tall grass beside the path, making barely a sound despite its size. The grass there is about waist high on me, but it barely came up to this thing's knees. I stood frozen for several more seconds before my survival instinct kicked in. I ran, leaving the wood scattered across the path, straight to the house, slamming and locking the door behind me. "Mark, what's wrong?" Lisa looked up from setting the table, her expression shifting from annoyed to concerned when she saw my face. "Nothing," I managed, not wanting to scare the kids who were already seated at the dinner table. "Just thought I saw something, probably just a deer." But it wasn't a deer, I knew that, and I spent the entire night peering out windows, checking locks and jumping at every creak and groan of our old house. The next morning, I went back to look for tracks. The logical part of my brain kept insisting I'd seen a bear, or maybe just shadows playing tricks on me. But the ground was too dry and hard-packed to show footprints. I gathered up the scattered firewood and tried to convince myself I'd overreacted. For a few days, I didn't mention it to anyone. What would I say? "Hey, honey, I think I saw Bigfoot in our backyard." I'd have sounded crazy. But then Lisa mentioned something that sent chills down my spine. "I saw something weird by the tree line yesterday," she said casually while we were doing dishes. "Probably nothing, but it looked like someone was standing there watching the house." "What time was this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Around 4, when I was waiting for the school bus to drop the kids off." I told her to stay inside with the kids while I checked something out, grabbed my rifle from the gun cabinet, and headed toward the area she'd mentioned. I didn't expect to find anything, but I needed to be sure. As I approached the tree line, I heard it, a rhythmic thudding sound, like someone striking wood against wood. Thunk, thunk, thunk. It was coming from deeper in the brush. I chambered around in my rifle, the click sounding impossibly loud in the quiet afternoon. The thudding stopped immediately. Complete silence followed. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish but not knowing what else to do. "This is private property." No response, just that eerie silence again. I waited for almost 10 minutes, then decided to head back. Whatever it was, probably just a woodpecker, I tried to tell myself. It was gone now. That evening, I drove down the same gravel road to check our mailbox at the main road. On my way back, headlights sweeping across the landscape, I caught movement in the tall grass about 50 yards from the house. I slowed down and directed my high beams toward it. There, crouched in the grass, was a dark figure. It wasn't standing upright this time, but hunched down as if trying to hide. When my headlights hit it, I swear I saw 2 eyes reflect back at me. Not the bright yellow-green of a deer's eyes, but a deep, reddish glow that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. The figure remained motionless, as if thinking I couldn't see it if it didn't move. I accelerated toward the house, told Lisa to keep the doors locked, and spent another night on edge. The next morning, I went back to that spot with my rifle. In the daylight, I found something that made my stomach drop. There was a large, oval-shaped depression in the grass, like something heavy had been lying there. It was much bigger than any deer bed I'd ever seen, about 7 feet long and wide enough for a very broad body. The grass was flattened in a deliberate pattern, not like when wind knocks it down randomly. I didn't tell Lisa about this. What was the point in scaring her? But I started making sure the kids were always inside before dark, and I installed more yard lights around our property. For about a month, things were quiet. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Then Lisa started mentioning seeing movements near the tree line across from our house. Never anything clear, just shadows moving in ways that didn't match up with the wind or wildlife patterns. It's like something's watching us, she said one evening in late November. I'll be doing dishes and get this feeling of being watched. When I look out the window, I see something move back into the trees. Winter came, bringing snow and shorter days. The sighting stopped, and I hoped whatever it was had moved on or gone into hibernation if it was some kind of animal. Then came early spring. The snow had mostly melted, leaving muddy patches across our property. It was a Sunday afternoon, unusually warm for March in Montana. Lisa and I were on the front porch, having coffee when we both saw it. A figure walking directly across our driveway in broad daylight. This one was smaller than what I'd seen in October, maybe about 6 feet tall, but still had that distinctive non-human gait. It walked with long strides, arms swinging oddly, and its entire body covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. It crossed the driveway about 50 yards from the house, moving from one wooded area to another, never looking our way. "Mark," Lisa whispered, gripping my arm so tight it hurt. "What the hell is that?" For once, I didn't have to pretend. I don't know, but I've seen something like it before. That night, we talked about what to do. Call the police? They'd think we were crazy. Tell the neighbors? Most of them lived miles away. Move? We couldn't afford to just up and leave our home. We decided to be vigilant, keep the kids close, and hope whatever these things were would leave us alone. A few nights later, Lisa woke me up around 2 in the morning, shaking my shoulder frantically. "There's something in the yard," she hissed, "right by the big oak tree." I grabbed my rifle and crept to the window. There, just as she'd said, was a figure standing motionless beside our oak tree. It was so still it almost looked like part of the tree, but when I adjusted my eyes to the darkness, I could make out its outline against the bark. It was just standing there, facing our house, not moving at all. I raised the window slightly, pointing my rifle through the gap, but when Lisa moved beside me, knocking a book off the nightstand, the figure vanished. Not ran away, vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks, but it was truly gone. We barely slept that night. In the morning, I checked around the tree and found nothing. No footprints in the soft spring soil, no broken branches, nothing to indicate anything had been there. After that night, the sightings stopped. Spring turned to summer, and we didn't see any more figures lurking around our property. But the feeling of being watched never quite went away. Sometimes, when I'm outside alone at dusk, I still get that prickly sensation on the back of my neck. I still hear unexplained wood knocks from the forest edge occasionally. And sometimes, very rarely, I'll catch a whiff of something musky and wild that doesn't belong to any animal I know. We still live in the same house. The kids are grown now, and neither remembers anything strange from that time. Lisa and I don't talk about it much anymore. What's the point? We have no proof, no explanation. Just the knowledge that for a few months in 2004 and early 2005, something was watching us. Something that shouldn't exist was taking an interest in our family. I've looked into similar sightings in Montana since then. Turns out there are quite a few reports from this region, though most people don't talk about them openly. Whatever I saw, I wasn't the first, and probably won't be the last. I just wish I knew why they were watching us, and sometimes on dark nights when I can't sleep, I wonder if they still are.